Before there was anything that hummed quietly to itself on a desk, before there were screens that glowed softly in the dark of a bedroom, before any of the machines we now carry in our pockets or rest beside our pillows, there was a person, sitting somewhere, with a pencil in one hand and a sheet of paper laid out flat on a table. And that person was called a computer. The word itself, computer, did not start out as the name of a machine at all. It started out as a job title, a role filled by a human being, someone who was paid to do arithmetic, hour after patient hour, until the numbers added up correctly. If you had walked into a large office or a university or a government bureau 150 or 200 years ago and asked to see the computer, no one would have led you to a clattering metal box or a blinking panel of lights. They would have led you to a quiet room where people, very often women, sat at rows of desks, turning the pages of thick books of mathematical tables and writing down long columns of figures with careful, steady hands. The work was repetitive. It was slow. It required a kind of calm concentration that most of us rarely practice anymore, a willingness to let the mind settle onto one small, exact problem at a time, and not hurry, not jump ahead, not grow restless. The human computer would take a sheet of numbers someone else had prepared, and she would add them, or subtract them, or multiply them, or divide them, and then she would write the result neatly in a ledger, and then she would turn the page and begin the next small, exact problem. The work stretched on like that for hours, sometimes for years, filling the quiet rooms of observatories and banks and shipping companies and scientific institutes with the soft scratch of pencil on paper, the rustle of a turned page, the occasional quiet murmur of a question asked and answered. No one thought of these rooms as the birthplace of a revolution. No one looked at a woman bent over her ledger and imagined that her work, her careful, repetitive, human work, would one day be done by a machine smaller than her hand, a machine that could perform not just hundreds of these little calculations in a day, but billions of them in a single second. The story we are about to walk through, very slowly, at the pace of someone who has nowhere to be and no alarm set for morning, is the story of how that happened. It is the story of how counting on fingers eventually led to the small, dark glass rectangle resting on your nightstand. But we are not in any hurry to get there. There is no rush at all. The journey itself is a kind of lullaby, a long and winding path through centuries of human ingenuity, and we can take it one gentle step at a time, stopping whenever we like to look around at the landscape of old ideas and forgotten machines. Imagine, if you will, the feeling of doing arithmetic entirely by hand, without any help from a device at all. Imagine holding a pencil and looking at a page covered in numbers that all need to be added together, column by column, carrying the ones, carrying the tens, double-checking your work because a single mistake meant starting the whole long column over again. That was the daily life of a human computer. The work was valuable and necessary. Without it, the great astronomical tables that sailors used to navigate the oceans would not have existed. Without it, the banks could not have balanced their accounts, the census offices could not have tallied their populations, the engineers could not have calculated the stresses on a bridge or the trajectory of a cannonball. All of the invisible arithmetic that underpins a modern society was once done by people who simply sat at desks and thought about numbers, one small step at a time. And the quiet, almost meditative quality of that work is something we have nearly lost, now that our machines do it for us in the background, silently, while we think about other things. There is a connection, a direct line, between the patient mind of a human computer in the 18th century and the sleeping phone on your nightstand, but the connection is not obvious, and we are not going to rush to make it obvious. Instead, we are going to let the story unfold in its own time, like a long thread being pulled gently from a spool, unspooling across the centuries, looping back on itself now and then, pausing at the moments when something small but important changed. The word computer, as a name for a person, has been traced back at least to the early 1600s, and for centuries after that, It was the only meaning the word had. If you read an old book or an old letter that mentions a computer, you can be almost certain that the writer is not describing a machine. They are describing a colleague, or an employee, or a stranger in a distant city who had a reputation for being very good at long division. Some human computers worked alone, freelancers who took on calculation projects for whoever would pay them. Others worked in large, organized groups, especially during times of war or major scientific projects, when the sheer volume of arithmetic needed was more than any single person could manage in a lifetime. In the 1700s and 1800s, for example, the governments of France and Britain funded huge projects to produce mathematical tables, books filled with pre-calculated values for things like the positions of the stars, the logarithms that simplified multiplication and division, and the trigonometric functions used in surveying and map-making. These tables were compiled by rooms full of human computers, many of them women, who were considered well-suited to the work because it required patience and care and a tolerance for repetition. The work was not glamorous, it did not pay especially well, but it was essential, and it was done with a quiet diligence that is worth pausing to appreciate, here in the dark, as you feel your own breathing slow down. Some of those computers, sitting at their desks in the gaslight or the early electric light of a government office, must have felt their minds drifting as the hours passed, the columns of numbers blurring slightly, the rhythm of the arithmetic becoming almost a kind of song, a soft chant of carried digits and written sums. They were, in a very real sense, the processors of their age, the living units of calculation that kept the machinery of science and commerce turning. And they were, in another sense, the first step in the story we are tracing, the baseline against which all the later machines would be measured. A machine that could calculate was, in its deepest essence, a machine that could do what those patient women did with their pencils and their paper. So let yourself imagine, for a little while, that you are one of them. You are sitting at a wooden desk in a room with high windows, the light falling softly on the page in front of you. The room is quiet except for the small sounds of other people breathing, other pencils moving, a chair creaking now and then. You have a sheet of numbers in front of you, a list of figures that need to be added together and then divided by some other number, and then the result needs to be written neatly in a ledger that will eventually be printed and bound and sent out to ships at sea or astronomers on remote hilltops. You dip your pen in the inkwell, or you sharpen your pencil with a small knife, and you begin. You do the first sum, you do the second sum, you do the third sum. You do not think about the end of the day, because the end of the day is hours away, and there is no point in thinking about it. You just let your mind settle into the task. Let the numbers flow through you like water. Let the small, satisfying click of a correct sum carry you forward to the next small, correct sum. This is what computing was, for a very long time. A human being, a mind, a hand, a pencil, and a page. And when we talk about the machines that came later, the machines that slowly, over generations, took over this quiet work, we are talking about devices that were trying, in their own limited ways, to do what you are imagining yourself doing right now. They were trying to be you, sitting at the desk, adding the numbers, one by one, without making a mistake. The fact that they eventually succeeded, that they eventually became faster than any human could ever be, does not erase the long, slow centuries when computing was something a person did, not something a person held. And now, as you lie here in the dark, you are surrounded by the descendants of those early machines. The phone on your nightstand, the laptop closed on the desk across the room, the small blinking lights of the router near the bookshelf, the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, which itself contains a tiny computer that monitors the temperature and decides when to turn the compressor on and off. All of these devices are, in their deepest logic, doing what the human computers did. They are taking in numbers, doing arithmetic with them, and producing new numbers. They just do it so fast and so silently that we have stopped thinking of it as arithmetic at all. We think of it as messages appearing on a screen, or music playing from a speaker, or a map that shows us where we are and where we are going. But underneath all of that, down at the very bottom of the stack of layers that make up a modern device, there is nothing but arithmetic, nothing but the same addition and subtraction and multiplication and division that the women at their desks were doing 200 years ago. The journey from there to here is long, but it is not a straight line, and it is not a story of sudden breakthroughs or dramatic revelations. It is a story of small steps, small improvements, small ideas that built on other small ideas, spread out over centuries, across continents, through the lives of thousands of people whose names we mostly do not remember. And that is why we can take our time with it. That is why we can let the story unroll at whatever pace feels restful, pausing whenever we like to look more closely at a particular moment, a particular machine, a particular person who sat down one day and thought of something that no one had quite thought of before. So let us begin, not at the beginning, because there is no single beginning in a story like this, but at a point far back enough to feel like a beginning, far back before any machine could do arithmetic at all. Let us begin with counting itself, with the very first tools that human beings ever used to keep track of numbers outside their own heads. Because before there were computers made of metal and silicon, before there were computers made of flesh and blood sitting at desks with pencils, there were people who counted on their fingers, and then people who counted with stones, and then people who carved notches into sticks and tied knots into cords. The impulse to count, to keep track, to make a record of how many sheep are in the flock or how many days have passed since the last full moon, is very old. It is older than writing. It is older than cities. It is one of the deepest and most fundamental things that human minds do. And the story of computing, the long, slow story we are walking through tonight, is really just the story of how we built better and better tools to help us do that one simple thing: to count, to keep track, to remember numbers so that we could think about other things. The woman at her desk with her pencil was already a long way down that road. The phone on your nightstand is further still, but the road itself stretches back into a past so deep and so quiet that we can barely see it, and walking that road together, one gentle step at a time, is what the hours ahead are for. There is no need to hurry. There is no need to stay fully awake. If your mind drifts, let it drift. The story will still be here, moving along at its own slow pace, and you can pick it up again whenever you like, or simply let the sound of the words wash over you like rain on a roof, steady and soft and asking nothing of you at all. The machines can wait, the centuries can wait. For now, just rest. The human hand, with its 5 fingers, was probably the first counting tool that ever existed. Long before anyone thought to scratch marks into a piece of bone or string beads onto a cord, people simply held up their fingers to show how many of something they meant. 1 finger for a single sheep, 2 fingers for a pair of oxen, all 5 fingers on one hand, and then all 5 on the other, and then perhaps the toes as well, when the numbers grew larger than 10. This is so old, so deeply embedded in who we are, that we can barely see it as a technology at all. But it is a technology. It is a tool outside the mind that helps the mind hold on to a number. And the fact that we have 10 fingers, which led almost every human culture to count in groups of 10, is the reason that the number 10 is the basis of the arithmetic you learned as a child. It is the reason we speak of tens, hundreds, thousands, and so on, each one 10 times larger than the one before. The word digit itself, which now means a single numeral like a 3 or a 7, comes from the Latin word digitus, which means finger. Even now, in a world of silicon and glass, we carry the echo of the human hand in our language. When you tap a number into your phone, you are using a word that remembers fingers. But fingers are not good at keeping a record. They cannot hold a number once you lower your hand. They cannot be left with a flock of sheep while you go home to sleep, and then picked up again in the morning to check that the count is still the same. For that, you need something more permanent, something that stays put when you are not looking at it. And so, very early in the story of human civilization, people began to use objects to stand in for numbers. A stone for each sheep, a shell for each measure of grain, a carved notch in a stick for each day of a journey, a knot tied in a cord for each basket of tribute owed to a distant ruler. These were the first counting machines, the first devices for storing numbers outside the human brain. They were simple, but they did exactly what all later machines would do, in a much more complicated way. They took a number that existed in someone's head, and they gave it a physical form that could be checked, copied, carried, and stored. They made numbers into things you could touch. One of the oldest and most widespread of these early tools is the abacus. The idea is so simple that it appeared independently in different parts of the world, over many centuries, without anyone needing to borrow it from anyone else. The basic principle is always the same. You have a frame, and on that frame are rods or grooves, and on those rods are beads or stones that can slide back and forth. Each rod stands for a different size of number, just like the columns in the arithmetic you learned in school. The rod on the far right stands for ones. The rod to its left stands for tens. The next rod stands for hundreds, and so on as far as the frame allows. To show a number, you slide some beads up toward the bar that runs across the middle of the frame and leave the others down. A bead that is pushed up into the active position counts as part of the number. A bead that is left down does not. By sliding beads up and down, a skilled user can add, subtract, multiply, and divide with surprising speed, far faster than someone working with pencil and paper, and certainly faster than someone working with stones on the ground. The abacus does not do the arithmetic for you. You still have to know the rules, the procedures, the steps to follow. But it holds the numbers for you as you work, keeping the ones, the tens, the hundreds, all neatly lined up in their proper places, so that your mind does not have to juggle them all at once. It is a memory aid, a device for extending the reach of the human brain, just as a hammer extends the reach of the human arm. In ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers where some of the first cities grew, people were using a form of abacus at least 4,000 years ago. They did not use beads on rods at first. They used a board with grooves, drawn in the dust or carved into stone, and they moved small stones or clay tokens along those grooves. The grooves kept the tokens organized, so that the tokens in one groove always meant ones, and the tokens in the next groove always meant tens, and the tokens in the next always meant 60s, because the Mesopotamians used a number system based on the number 60, not 10. Traces of that ancient 60-based system survive even now, in the way we divide an hour into 60 minutes and a minute into 60 seconds, a quiet reminder of the counting boards of Babylon and Sumer. In China, the abacus we would recognize today, with beads on rods inside a wooden frame, was in use by at least the 2nd century, and it spread across Asia, taking on slightly different forms in different places. In Japan, it became the soroban. In Russia, it became the skoti. In each place, children learned to use it in school, and merchants used it in their shops, and tax collectors used it in government offices. The clicking of the beads, the smooth sliding of wood on wood, the quick, rhythmic movements of a practiced hand, all of this was the sound of calculation for centuries upon centuries, a sound so familiar and so ordinary that no one would have thought to remark on it. The abacus was simply how you did arithmetic if you had serious arithmetic to do. And here is a thought worth resting on for a moment, in the quiet dark. The abacus is still in use today. In some parts of the world, children still learn to slide the beads. Shopkeepers still keep one on the counter. It has not been replaced, not entirely, by the electronic calculator that you can buy for a few dollars at any corner store. It has simply been joined by newer tools. The old tool and the new tool sit side by side, doing the same work, one with beads and wood, the other with silicon and electricity. The abacus has outlasted empires. It has outlasted entire civilizations. It was old when the Roman Empire fell, and it was still being used when the first electronic computers were built. That kind of durability is worth noticing. It tells us something about what a tool really is, and what a computer really is. A tool that works well, that fits neatly into the human hand and the human mind, does not need to be replaced. It simply persists, quietly, in the background, while the world changes around it. But an abacus, for all its elegance, is not a machine that calculates by itself. It is a frame for holding numbers while a human being calculates. The next step in the story, the step toward a device that does some of the work on its own, is harder to pin down because it happened so long ago and left so few traces. We have to rely on fragments, on objects recovered from ancient shipwrecks, on hints in old texts, on the slow, painstaking work of archaeologists and historians who piece together the past from whatever happens to have survived. And what has survived is very little. Wood rots, metal corrodes. Gears made of bronze sink to the bottom of the sea and sit there for 2,000 years, slowly encrusting with barnacles and minerals, until a diver happens to find them and wonders what they might once have been. That is the story of the Antikythera mechanism, a device that deserves a few minutes of our attention, not because it led directly to anything that came later, but because it tells us that the human desire to build a machine that could calculate is far older than we might otherwise guess. In the year 1900, a crew of Greek sponge divers, taking shelter from a storm near the small island of Antikythera, between the mainland of Greece and the island of Crete, found the remains of an ancient shipwreck on the seafloor. The wreck was full of bronze and marble statues, pottery, coins, and other treasures, and these were hauled up over the following months. But among the statues and the coins was a lump of corroded bronze, green with age, that looked like nothing in particular. It sat in a museum for a long time, unexamined, while scholars focused on the more obviously beautiful objects from the same wreck. And then someone noticed that the lump seemed to have gear wheels inside it. Very small, very precise gear wheels, with teeth cut into them, meshing together in ways that could only mean they were part of some kind of mechanical device. Over the decades that followed, researchers used X-rays and careful cleaning to reveal more and more of what was inside that lump. What emerged, slowly, was a device of astonishing complexity, a box of bronze gears that had been built, as best anyone can tell, around the end of the 2nd century before the Common Era, more than 2,000 years ago. The Antikythera mechanism, as it is now called, was a kind of astronomical calculator. By turning a handle on the side, the user could set a date, and the gears inside would move pointers on a dial to show the positions of the sun, the moon, and probably the planets, as well as the timing of eclipses and the dates of important events in the Greek calendar. It was a model of the heavens, built out of metal, accurate enough to predict an eclipse years in advance. The level of mechanical skill required to build it was very high, higher than anyone had expected to find in the ancient world. The gear wheels were cut with teeth that meshed smoothly. The layout of the gears encoded mathematical relationships that described the cycles of the moon and the sun, including the subtle irregularity of the moon's motion across the sky. This was not a simple machine. It was the product of a long tradition of mechanical craftsmanship, a tradition that we know almost nothing about, because almost nothing else like it has survived. And that is worth pausing over too. The Antikythera mechanism is a reminder that history is full of gaps. We see only the tiny fraction of the past that happened to survive, and we have to be careful not to assume that what survived is all there was. The historians who study this device still debate exactly how advanced Greek and Roman mechanical knowledge really was, and how widely such devices were made and used. Some think the Antikythera mechanism was a rare, almost unique object, the work of a single brilliant workshop. Others think it was part of a broader tradition of geared devices that simply have not survived, because bronze was valuable and was melted down and reused, and wood rotted away to nothing. The honest answer is that we do not know. The evidence is too thin, too fragmentary to settle the question. And that not knowing is not a problem to be solved. It is just part of the texture of the past, a quiet reminder that the people who came before us had their own deep knowledge, their own skilled hands, their own ways of thinking about numbers and the sky, and we will never fully recover what they knew. So we can let the Antikythera mechanism rest there, in its glass case in the museum in Athens, a small, green, mysterious object that whispers of lost skills and forgotten machines. It did not lead, in any direct line, to the computers we use today. The knowledge of how to build such things seems to have faded, or at least to have gone underground, for many centuries after the Roman world fell apart. But it tells us something important about the impulse behind all of this. The impulse is not new. The desire to build a device that mirrors the movements of the heavens, that takes a number and turns it into a prediction, that offloads some of the work of thinking onto gears and dials and pointers, has been with us for a very long time. It was with the Greek bronze smiths of the 2nd century before the Common Era. It was with the Mesopotamian scribes who moved their tokens in the dust. It was with the Inca officials in the Andes who tied colored knots into cords to record the census of their empire, a system called the quipu, which used a base 10 number system just like ours, encoded in the position and color of the knots, a system so effective that it served as the administrative backbone of a vast and complex state. And it was with the medieval tally sticks, wooden sticks into which notches were cut to record debts and payments, the stick then split down the middle so that the debtor and the creditor each held a half that matched the other exactly, a simple and nearly foolproof way of preventing forgery. The British government used tally sticks for tax records all the way up to the early 1800s, burning the last of them in 1834 in a fire that grew out of control and burned down the old Houses of Parliament. A quiet end for a technology that had served for centuries. All of these devices, from the abacus to the quipu to the tally stick to the Antikythera mechanism, share a common purpose. They are ways of making numbers physical, ways of storing information outside the fragile vault of the human memory. They are the first steps on the long, slow road that leads, eventually, to the small glowing screen beside your bed. But they are also complete in themselves. They are not just precursors to something better. They were, in their own time and place, the best tools available, perfectly suited to the needs of the people who used them. The merchant in ancient China who balanced his accounts on an abacus was not waiting for a calculator to be invented. He had what he needed. The Inca administrator who read the knots in a quipu was not dreaming of a spreadsheet. He was doing his job, competently and well, with the tools of his culture. The road we are walking is not a story of steady improvement, with each new device better than the one before. It is a story of different people in different times, each solving the same basic problem of counting and recording, each with the materials and the knowledge they had at hand. And now, as we near the end of this section of our journey, we can let our gaze drift forward a little, toward a time when the materials and the knowledge would shift, and a new kind of machine would begin to appear. The abacus could hold numbers, but it could not perform an operation on its own. The Antikythera mechanism could model the heavens, but it could only do the one thing it was built to do. The next step, the step we will take when we are ready, is the invention of machines that could follow a rule, that could take a number and change it according to a fixed procedure, that could, in a small and limited way, think a little. But that step is still a long way off in the darkness, and there is no need to rush toward it. For now, it is enough to rest with the image of a bead sliding on a rod, a knot tied in a colored cord, a gear turning slowly in a bronze box at the bottom of the sea. The machines can wait. The story will continue when the time is right. For now, just let the centuries wash over you like waves, one after another, slow and steady and carrying you gently forward into sleep. The centuries between the ancient world and the 17th century saw many changes in the way people lived, worked, and thought, but the basic tools of calculation stayed more or less the same. The abacus, in one form or another, remained the most reliable way to do arithmetic for anyone who needed to do it quickly and accurately. Paper and pencil, combined with the numerals we now use every day, the ones we call Arabic numerals even though they originated in India, slowly spread across Europe and made written calculation easier. But the dream of a machine that could do some of the thinking for you, a machine that could take a number and change it according to a fixed rule, without a human hand sliding beads, or a human mind keeping track of the steps, that dream lay dormant for a long time. It did not vanish. It was always there, in the background, a quiet possibility waiting for the right combination of skill, need, and circumstance. And in the 1600s, that combination began to come together in the workshops of a few remarkable individuals. The first of them, the one whose name is usually spoken first when this part of the story is told, was a Frenchman named Blaise Pascal. He was born in 1623 in the town of Clermont, in the center of France, and from a very early age it was clear that his mind worked in ways that set him apart. His father, Etienne Pascal, was a tax collector and a mathematician in his own right, and he took charge of his son's education, moving the family to Paris so that the boy could grow up surrounded by the ideas and the thinkers of the day. Blaise Pascal was not a healthy child. All his life he struggled with illnesses that left him weak and in pain, but his mind was restless and sharp, and by the time he was a young man, he had already made contributions to geometry and physics that would have marked him as extraordinary, even if he had done nothing else. But the thing that concerns us tonight, the thing that earns Pascal a place in this long, slow story, is a machine he began to build when he was only 18 years old. His father, the tax collector, spent his days doing arithmetic. Long columns of figures, taxes owed, payments received, interest calculated, all of it done by hand, over and over, with the constant risk of a small error that could cause large problems. Pascal wanted to help. He wanted to build a machine that could do some of that arithmetic automatically, a machine that could add and subtract without a human brain having to carry the digits from one column to the next. The result was a device he called the Pascaline, a name formed from his own name, though he never called it that himself in his lifetime. It was a mechanical adding machine, built from brass and steel, housed in a polished box about the size of a shoebox, with a row of small windows on the top where the numbers appeared, and a series of dials on the front that the user turned with a stylus. The way it worked was simple in principle, though it required remarkable precision to build. Each dial was connected to a gear, and each gear had 10 teeth. When you turned the dial past 9, a small mechanism carried the extra one over to the next gear to the left, just as you would carry a 1 to the next column when adding by hand. The machine could handle numbers up to a certain length, depending on how many dials it had, and it could add and subtract with complete reliability, provided the gears were well made and the user turned the dials carefully. It did not multiply or divide directly. It was, in the truest sense, an adding machine, a device for taking numbers in and producing their sum or their difference. But it was a machine, not a frame for holding numbers while a person thought. It did the carrying on its own. The gears meshed, the teeth caught, the little windows clicked over to show the correct digit, and the human operator did not have to think about the arithmetic at all, only about turning the dials to the right positions. Pascal built his first working model in 1642, and over the following years he made several more, refining the design and trying to attract interest. He received a royal privilege from the King of France, giving him exclusive rights to make and sell the machines. But the Pascaline was never a commercial success. It was expensive to build, difficult to maintain, and most people who needed arithmetic done were perfectly content to hire a human computer or use an abacus. The machine was a curiosity, a marvel of craftsmanship, but not something that anyone really needed. Only about 20 of them were made, and a handful survive in museums today, their brass gears still gleaming faintly under the lights, their little number windows still ready to show a sum to anyone who turns the dials. Pascal's machine did not change the world, not by itself, but it proved something important. It proved that a mechanism of gears and levers could take over a piece of mental work that had always belonged to human beings. The carrying of a digit, that small, almost unconscious step in addition that every child learns in school, could be built into metal. The machine did not have to think. It did not have to understand numbers. It just had to be shaped in a certain way, with teeth and catches and springs arranged so that the motion of one gear would force the next gear to move in a predictable way. That was the key idea, the idea that a physical object could embody a rule of arithmetic. The rule was no longer something you had to remember and apply with your mind. The rule was built into the shape of the metal, and every time you turned the dial, the rule played itself out automatically. Pascal was not the only person thinking along these lines. A few decades after him, a German mathematician and philosopher named Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz took the idea further. Leibniz was born in 1646 in Leipzig, and his mind ranged across more subjects than almost anyone of his era. He wrote about philosophy, theology, law, history, linguistics, and mathematics. He invented a form of calculus independently of Isaac Newton, and the notation he developed is still used in mathematics textbooks today. He believed that all reasoning could, in principle, be reduced to a kind of calculation, and that a machine might one day be able to settle arguments by simply computing the correct answer from agreed-upon starting points. That vision was far beyond anything that could be built in his lifetime, but it tells you something about the way his mind worked. He saw computation as a universal language, a way of resolving any question that could be stated clearly enough. In 1673, Leibniz presented a calculating machine of his own design to the Royal Society in London. He called it the step reckoner, from the German word rechnen, meaning to calculate. The step reckoner was more ambitious than Pascal's machine. It could add and subtract, yes, but it could also multiply and divide. The way it did this was clever. Instead of just turning a dial the right number of times to add a number, which would be slow and tedious for multiplication, the step reckoner used a component called a stepped cylinder, a drum with ridges of different lengths along its surface. By moving a gear along the cylinder, the machine could engage a different number of teeth on each turn, allowing it to multiply by shifting the gear and then turning the crank. Division worked by reversing the process. It was, in essence, a mechanical way of doing the repeated addition and subtraction that underlie multiplication and division, but done with a single turn of the crank for each digit, rather than having to turn the crank over and over. The step reckoner, like the Pascaline before it, was a beautiful and ingenious device that did not sell very well. Leibniz made only a few of them, and the one he demonstrated in London was not fully finished. The stepped cylinder design was clever in theory, but it required extremely precise machining to work reliably, and the technology of the time was barely up to the task. The machines that were built tended to jam. The gears wore down unevenly. The cost of making them was far too high for any ordinary office or workshop. They remained the possessions of the very wealthy or the very influential, displayed in cabinets of curiosities rather than put to work on real accounting problems. Leibniz himself moved on to other things, as great minds often do, but the step reckoner left a legacy. The stepped cylinder mechanism he invented was used in mechanical calculators for another 200 years. Well into the 20th century, long after Leibniz himself was forgotten by everyone except historians and mathematicians, his little stepped drums were still turning inside, adding machines on desks all over the world. So what should we take from this chapter of the story, here in the quiet dark? It is not that Pascal or Leibniz changed the world overnight. They did not. Their machines were too expensive, too fragile, too rare. The world went on doing arithmetic by hand, with abacuses and paper and human computers, for a very long time after they were gone. But they planted a seed. They showed, clearly and concretely, that a machine could be built that would follow a fixed procedure and produce a result that a human being would call calculation. The machine did not know it was calculating. It had no awareness, no understanding, no mind. It was just a collection of metal parts arranged in a particular way. But when you turned the crank, The parts moved as they were shaped to move, and at the end, a number appeared in a little window, and that number was the sum, or the product, or the quotient, of the numbers you had set at the beginning. The rule was in the shape of the machine. The intelligence, such as it was in the design, not in the device. That is a thought worth holding on to, because it will echo through all the centuries that follow. Every computer that has ever existed, from the brass gears of the Pascaline to the silicon chips in the phone beside your bed, works on this same basic principle. The machine does not think. It does not know what a number is. It is just a physical system, a set of parts arranged so that one state leads inevitably to another, according to rules that were built into it by its designers. The brilliance is in the design, not in the device. The device is just the obedient physical body that carries out the instructions. Pascal and Leibniz, working in their separate workshops with their brass and their files and their patient, skilled hands, were the first to make that principle visible, to give it a tangible form that you could hold and turn and watch as it worked. They did not build computers in the modern sense. They built mechanical calculators, single-purpose machines that could do arithmetic and nothing else. But the line between a calculator and a computer, as we will see later in the story, is thinner than it might seem. A calculator follows a fixed rule to change numbers into other numbers. A computer does the same thing, but the rules it follows can be changed, swapped out, rewritten. The step from a fixed rule to a changeable rule is enormous, and it took centuries to make. But the first step, the step of building any rule at all into metal, was taken in the 1600s by a sickly French genius who wanted to help his father with his taxes, and by a German polymath who believed that all reasoning could be reduced to calculation. And now, as we let our breathing slow and our thoughts drift, we can picture these early machines sitting quietly on their shelves. The Pascaline, with its polished brass dials and its neat row of little windows, each one showing a single digit. The step reckoner, with its stepped cylinders and its hand crank, a little larger, a little more complex, capable of a little more. They were not used by ordinary people. An ordinary person in the 1600s, if they needed to add something, simply did it in their head or asked someone who could. These machines were for scholars, for officials, for the very few who had both the need for exact calculation and the money to pay for a hand-crafted mechanical marvel. They were the rare, expensive toys of an intellectual elite, and they might have been forgotten entirely if the idea behind them had not been so powerful. But the idea survived. The idea that a machine could do arithmetic, that the work of the human computer could be taken over by gears and levers, settled into the minds of the people who saw these devices or read about them. It became part of the background knowledge of the centuries that followed, a quiet possibility that waited for better materials, better tools, and a clearer sense of what it might mean. The next piece of the puzzle would come from a direction that no one could have predicted, from an industry that had nothing to do with numbers or calculation at all. It would come from the weaving of silk, from the loom of a Frenchman named Jacquard, who found a way to tell a machine what pattern to weave by punching holes in a stiff piece of card. But that is a story for another part of the night, a story that we will ease into when the time is right. For now it is enough to rest with the image of gears turning, of brass teeth catching and releasing, of a small polished box sitting on a desk in a candle-lit room in Paris or Leipzig, clicking softly as a hand turns a crank, a number appearing in a little window, correct and steady and requiring no thought at all. The machines are patient, they can wait. They have been waiting for centuries, and they will still be there when we are ready to pick up the thread again. For now, just let the quiet clicking of the gears fade into the sound of your own breathing, slow and regular, carrying you gently deeper into rest. The story of computing, for all its gears and numbers and electrical currents, has a branch that leads away from the counting house and the mathematician's study, and into a place that might seem, at first, to have nothing to do with calculation at all. That place is a weaving shed, a long room filled with looms, where the air is thick with the smell of wool and silk and the sound of shuttles flying back and forth, hour after hour, turning thread into cloth. Weaving, in its essence, is a kind of pattern making. The weaver takes threads that run in one direction, called the warp, and threads that run in the perpendicular direction, called the weft, and by raising some warp threads and lowering others, the weaver creates a design in the fabric. The simplest weave is just over one, under one, over one, under one, a plain, smooth cloth with no pattern at all. But if you want something more complex, a flower, a geometric design, a picture woven into the fabric so that it seems to grow out of the threads themselves, the work becomes much more complicated. The weaver, or an assistant, often a child, has to raise and lower the right warp threads for each pass of the shuttle, following a pattern that must be remembered or read from a chart. A single mistake, one wrong thread lifted or left down, and the pattern is broken. The cloth is spoiled. The hours of work are wasted. For centuries, the most intricate patterned fabrics, the brocades and the damasks and the silks that were worth more than their weight in gold, were made by highly skilled workers who spent years learning their craft, and the pace of the work was slow, painstaking, a single yard of fine fabric representing weeks of labor at the loom. And then, in the early years of the 1800s, a French weaver and inventor named Joseph-Marie Jacquard changed everything. He did not invent the loom. He did not invent the idea of using punched cards to control a machine, because that idea had been tried in a simpler form a few decades earlier by another Frenchman named Basile Bouchon, who used a roll of punched paper to control a loom, and then improved by Jean-Baptiste Falcon, who replaced the paper roll with a chain of punched cards. But Jacquard took these earlier experiments and made them work, made them reliable, made them into a practical machine that could be built and sold and used in weaving sheds across France and then across the world. The Jacquard loom, as it came to be called, was not a new kind of loom in its basic structure. It was a standard loom with an attachment mounted on top, a device that used a series of stiff rectangular cards, each one punched with a pattern of holes, to control which warp threads were lifted for each pass of the shuttle. The cards were laced together into a long chain, like a belt made of cardboard, and they were fed into the top of the loom one by one, in order. As each card was pressed against a set of rods, the holes allowed some rods to pass through, while the solid parts of the card pushed other rods back. The rods that passed through a hole left their warp threads alone. The rods that were pushed back lifted their warp threads up. The shuttle flew across, carrying the weft thread, and then the card advanced. The next card took its place. A new set of rods was read, a new set of threads was lifted, and the shuttle flew back the other way. Card by card, row by row, the pattern built up in the cloth, exactly as the holes in the card specified. The beauty of the Jacquard loom was not just that it automated the weaving of complex patterns, though that was remarkable enough. A single weaver with a Jacquard loom could produce patterned fabric at a speed that would have required a small team of workers before. The patterns were consistent, repeatable, and they could be changed simply by swapping out the chain of cards. If you wanted to weave a different design, you did not have to rebuild the loom or retrain the weaver. You simply punched a new set of cards and laced them together, and the same machine, the same rods and hooks and shuttles, would produce a completely different fabric. The cards were the instructions, and the loom was the machine that read them and carried them out. This was the crucial idea, the idea that would echo down through the centuries and eventually find its way into the very heart of modern computing. A machine could be told what to do, not by being rebuilt or rewired, but by being fed a sequence of physical instructions, a set of cards with holes in them, a pattern that the machine could read and follow. Let us pause for a moment, here in the dark, and think about what a punched card really is. It is a very simple thing, a piece of stiff cardboard, cut to a precise size, with a grid of possible positions where a hole could be punched. At each position, the card either has a hole or it does not. The machine that reads the card feels, with a set of rods or pins, whether there is a hole or not at each position. If there is a hole, the rod passes through. If there is no hole, the rod is stopped. That is all. A hole or no hole, a yes or a no, a pass or a stop. This is a language, but not a language of words. It is a language of presence and absence, of open and closed, a language that can be read by a machine that has no eyes, no brain, no understanding of what it is doing. The weaver does not need to know how the loom reads the cards. The loom does not need to know that it is weaving a picture of a rose. The information flows from the holes in the card, through the rods, to the lifting of the threads, and a rose appears in the cloth, all without anyone or anything understanding what a rose is. The pattern is stored, physically, in the arrangement of holes, and the machine can follow that pattern over and over, producing the same result every time, until the cards wear out or the weaver decides to change them. Jacquard's invention was recognized in his own lifetime as something extraordinary. He received a medal from Napoleon. The city of Lyon, the center of the French silk industry where he had worked and struggled for years, adopted his loom and honored his name. He was not a mathematician, not an engineer in the formal sense, not a member of the scientific academies that had celebrated Pascal and Leibniz. He was a weaver's son, a practical man who had spent his life around looms and thread and understood, in a deep, intuitive way, how the work of weaving could be broken down into small, repeatable steps. His looms spread across Europe. By the 1820s, thousands of Jacquard looms were in use in France, in England, in the German states, in the growing textile mills that were the engines of the Industrial Revolution. The punched card had become a standard industrial tool, a way of storing and transmitting instructions that was reliable, repeatable, and easy to understand. And the idea that a machine could be controlled by a swappable set of instructions, that the same machine could do entirely different jobs depending on what cards you fed into it, was now out in the world, visible to anyone who walked through a weaving shed and saw the chains of cards clattering over the top of the loom, row by row, pattern by pattern. Now, the connection between a loom and a computer might seem distant, but the distance is smaller than it appears. A Jacquard loom is not a calculating device. It does not add or subtract or multiply. It does not process numbers, but it does process information. It takes a set of instructions, stored in a physical form, and it carries them out, one by one, to produce a result. The instructions are read in a fixed order. Each instruction tells the machine to do something specific, something small and simple, like lift this thread, or leave this thread down. The sequence of these small, simple actions builds up over time to create something complex, something that would be very difficult to produce without the machine. That pattern, of a machine following a stored sequence of simple instructions to produce a complex result, is exactly the pattern that a computer follows. The only difference is that a loom's instructions produce a patterned fabric, while a computer's instructions produce a calculation. The underlying logic is the same. The people who would later build the first general-purpose computers, the people whose names we will come to in the next sections of this story, knew about the Jacquard loom. They had seen it, or read about it, or understood its significance. Charles Babbage, who we will meet properly very soon, owned a woven portrait of Joseph Marie Jacquard that was itself made on a Jacquard loom. The portrait, woven in silk, was so detailed that it looked like an etching, but it was made of thread, produced row by a machine following a chain of punched cards. Babbage kept that portrait on his wall, and he showed it to visitors as an example of what a machine could do when it was fed the right instructions. The idea that a machine could be programmed, that its actions could be changed at will by swapping out the set of cards that controlled it, was not an abstract concept to Babbage. It was a physical object, a woven picture, a piece of cloth that he could touch and hold and examine. The Jacquard loom had shown, in the most tangible way possible, that a machine could be given a sequence of instructions and that it would follow them faithfully, producing a result that was far more complex than the instructions themselves. And so, as we let our breathing slow and the darkness settle around us, we can hold in our minds the image of this loom, this unlikely ancestor of the computer. A wooden frame, a chain of cards, a shuttle flying back and forth, and slowly, row by row, a pattern emerging in the cloth. The weaver sits nearby, not raising threads by hand, not calling out instructions to an assistant, but simply watching the machine do its work, tending it when it needs tending, and otherwise letting it run. The knowledge of the pattern is not in the weaver's head, it is in the cards. The weaver does not need to remember which thread to lift for row 247 of the design, because the card for that row has a hole in the right place, and the loom's rods will find that hole and lift the right thread, and the shuttle will fly, and the pattern will advance by one more row. The machine remembers so that the human does not have to. That is the essence of what a computer does, and it is the Jacquard loom that first made that essence clear. Clear enough that the next generation of inventors could look at it and say, I see what is possible here. I see how to take this idea and apply it to numbers instead of threads. The loom is still there, in the background of the story. We will not linger on it much longer, but we will carry its central idea forward with us. The idea of stored instructions, the idea of a swappable program, the idea that a machine can be told what to do by feeding it a pattern of holes on a card, or on a strip of paper, or eventually on a magnetic tape, a spinning disc, a flash of light through a fiber optic cable. The form changes, but the logic remains. The holes are just holes. The machine is just a machine. But together, the holes and the machine can weave a rose, or calculate a logarithm, or send a message across the world. The thread that connects the weaving shed to the data center is long and tangled, but it is real, and we are following it slowly, one gentle step at a time, through the quiet of the night. And now, as this section of the story draws toward its close, we can let the sound of the loom fade, the clatter of the cards, the rush of the shuttle, all of it softening into the background, like rain on a distant roof. The next part of our journey will take us to two people, a man and a woman, who looked at the punched cards of the Jacquard loom and saw something that no one had quite seen before. They saw that the same idea, the idea of feeding instructions to a machine on cards, could be applied not just to weaving patterns in silk, but to weaving numbers into tables, to calculating and printing, and even, in some visionary sense, to thinking. But that is a step we are not quite ready to take. For now it is enough to rest with the loom, with the cards, with the quiet understanding that a machine can remember, and that the memory can be held in a piece of cardboard, and that this simple fact, once it was understood, would change everything. The cards are still, the shuttle is quiet, the threads hang loose, the pattern is half-woven, waiting for the morning, and you are drifting, slowly, toward a sleep that needs no pattern, no instructions, no cards, just the gentle undoing of the day, thread by thread. The man who kept a woven portrait of Joseph Marie Jacquard on his wall was named Charles Babbage. He was born in London in 1791, the son of a wealthy banker, and he grew up to become a mathematician, an inventor, and one of the most restless and complicated figures in the whole history of computing. Even as a boy, he was fascinated by machines, by the way that gears and levers could be arranged to do work that would otherwise require a human hand or a human mind. He studied mathematics at Cambridge, and he was very good at it, but he was never content to sit quietly in a university and think abstract thoughts. He wanted to build things. He wanted to take the ideas that lived in his head and give them physical form, in brass and steel, in gear trains and cams and linkages that would move in precise, predictable ways. And the thing that most occupied his mind, the problem that he kept returning to year after year, was the problem of mathematical tables. To understand why tables mattered so much to Babbage, we have to understand what a mathematical table was and why it was so important in his time. A mathematical table is simply a book full of pre-calculated numbers, arranged in rows and columns so that a person who needs a particular value can look it up without having to calculate it from scratch. The most common kind was a table of logarithms. A logarithm, in very simple terms, is a number that turns multiplication into addition, and that made it much easier to do complicated arithmetic before there were machines to do it for you. Instead of multiplying two large numbers by hand, you could look up their logarithms in a table, add those logarithms together, and then look up the result in the table again to find the product. This was how astronomers, navigators, surveyors, and engineers did their calculations. The tables were their essential tools, and the accuracy of those tables was a matter of life and death. A ship at sea, navigating by the stars, could be lost if a single digit in a logarithmic table was wrong. A bridge could collapse. An artillery shell could fall on friendly troops. The tables had to be correct, absolutely correct, and the only way to make them correct was to have human computers work through every value, checking and rechecking, a process that was slow, expensive, and still prone to error, because humans, however careful, make mistakes. Babbage, in his early 20s, was working with a set of mathematical tables one day when he grew frustrated with the errors he kept finding. The story, which may be a little polished by retelling, says that he exclaimed to a friend, "I wish to God these calculations had been executed by steam." Steam engines were the great power source of the age, driving the factories and the ships and the trains that were transforming the world. Babbage's thought, whether he said it aloud or not, was that a steam-driven machine might be able to calculate tables automatically, without the errors that plagued human work. And unlike Pascal's adding machine or Leibniz's step reckoner, which simply did arithmetic on the numbers you fed into them, this machine would produce the tables themselves. It would calculate a whole sequence of values, print them out, and guarantee that every digit was correct. The machine he envisioned came to be called the difference engine, because it was based on a mathematical method called the method of finite differences, a way of calculating tables by repeatedly adding the same set of differences to produce the next value in a sequence. The beauty of the method was that it required only addition. The machine did not need to multiply or divide. It just needed to add, over and over, with absolute precision, and it could crank out page after page of correct tables. Babbage began designing the difference engine in the early 1820s, and he was very good at designing. The plans he drew up called for a machine with thousands of precisely machined parts, gears and cogs and levers, all working together to perform the simple, repetitive addition that the method required. The British government, recognizing the value of accurate tables for navigation and science, agreed to fund the project. Babbage hired skilled craftsmen, built a workshop, and set to work. But the project dragged on and on and on. The precision required was beyond what the manufacturing techniques of the day could reliably produce. The parts had to be made by hand, each gear tooth cut individually, and if a single part was slightly out of tolerance, the whole machine would jam or produce wrong results. Babbage kept refining the design, but he also kept getting into disputes with his workmen, with his funders, with everyone who tried to help or hurry him. The money ran out. The government, after more than a decade of funding with no working machine to show for it, withdrew its support. Babbage never finished the full difference engine. A small working model, about 1/7 of the complete machine, was built and demonstrated, and it worked beautifully, calculating a sequence of numbers and printing the results. But the full machine, the room-size steam-powered calculator that Babbage had promised, never left the drawing board. And yet, even as the difference engine project was faltering, Babbage's mind was already racing ahead to something far more ambitious. He had seen the Jacquard loom, with its chain of punched cards, and he had understood, with a clarity that no one before him had quite achieved, that the same idea could be applied to calculation. If a loom could be told to weave a rose by feeding it a set of punched cards, then a calculating machine could be told to perform a complex mathematical operation by feeding it a different set of punched cards. The machine would not be limited to one kind of calculation, like the difference engine. It would be a general-purpose machine, a machine that could be programmed, a machine that could follow any sequence of mathematical instructions that could be written down on the cards. Babbage called this new idea the Analytical Engine, and he spent the rest of his life designing it, sketching it, revising it, but never building it. The Analytical Engine was a machine of extraordinary conceptual sophistication. It had a section called the store, which held numbers, much like the memory in a modern computer. It had a section called the mill, which performed arithmetic on the numbers taken from the store, much like a modern processor. It could take input from punched cards and produce output on a printer. It could, in principle, make decisions, choosing between different courses of action based on the result of a previous calculation. It was, on paper, a general-purpose computer designed in the 1830s and 1840s, a full century before the first electronic computers were built. But it existed only on paper, in Babbage's drawings and notes, and in the imagination of the few people who truly understood what he was trying to do. One of those people, and the one whose name has become most closely linked with Babbage's in the years since, was a woman named Ada Lovelace. She was born Augusta Ada Byron in 1815, the daughter of the poet Lord Byron, though her parents separated when she was an infant, and she never really knew her father. Her mother, Annabella Milbanke, was determined that Ada would not grow up to be like Byron, tempestuous and romantic and unreliable, and so she had her educated in mathematics and logic from an early age, subjects that were considered unusual for a young woman of her class. Ada showed a gift for them. She was clear-minded, curious, and not afraid of abstract ideas. She met Charles Babbage in 1833, when she was 17 and he was 41, and they formed a friendship that lasted the rest of her life. Babbage showed her his workshop, his models, his plans, and she understood them. She understood them in a way that few other people did. She saw not just the gears and the levers, but the ideas, the possibilities, the vision of a machine that could do something that looked almost like thinking. In 1843, an Italian mathematician named Luigi Federico Menabrea wrote a paper in French describing Babbage's Analytical Engine. Ada Lovelace translated that paper into English, but she did much more than translate. At Babbage's suggestion, she added her own notes, and those notes ended up being far longer than the original paper. They are the reason she is remembered today. In those notes, Lovelace explained, step by step, how the analytical engine could be programmed to perform a specific calculation, the computation of a sequence of numbers called the Bernoulli numbers. This step-by-step sequence of instructions is often described as the first published algorithm, a word that would not come into common use for another century, but that essentially means a precise set of rules for solving a problem. Lovelace wrote down the sequence of operations that the machine would need to perform, the way the cards would have to be arranged, the way the numbers would move from the store to the mill and back again. It was a detailed, technical piece of work, and it showed that she had a deep grasp of what the analytical engine could do. But Lovelace also wrote something else in those notes, something that went beyond the technical and into the visionary. She wrote about what the analytical engine might mean, about the boundaries of what a machine could do. She noted that the machine could only follow the instructions it was given. It could not originate anything. It could do whatever it was told to do, provided the instructions were clear and complete, but it could not have its own ideas. And she also speculated about what kinds of things might one day be expressed as instructions. She suggested that if music, for example, could be represented in a mathematical form, then the analytical engine might one day compose music. This was a remarkable leap of imagination, a prediction that computers might one day process not just numbers but symbols, patterns, creative works. It would take more than a century for that prediction to come true, but it did come true, and Ada Lovelace was one of the very first people to see that it was possible. Now, here we must pause and speak plainly, because the story of Babbage and Lovelace is not a simple story, and historians still discuss and debate some of its details. The question of how much of the visionary framing in those notes was Lovelace's own original thinking, and how much was a translation and expansion of ideas Babbage had already discussed with her, is not perfectly settled. Babbage himself had written about many of these ideas in his own unpublished notes. He clearly understood the potential of his machine. But Lovelace's notes, published under her own initials, became the most famous and influential statement of that potential. Some historians argue that her contribution has been overstated in recent years, that she was an able student and explainer of Babbage's ideas rather than an original thinker in her own right. Others argue that her notes show a clarity and a breadth of vision that went beyond what Babbage had committed to paper, and that she deserves her place as a foundational figure in the history of computing. The truth, as is so often the case with collaborations and conversations that happened long ago, is probably somewhere in the middle, and it is not something we need to resolve here. What we can say with certainty is that Ada Lovelace wrote the most detailed and widely read account of the analytical engine's capabilities that appeared in the 19th century. She was one of the very few people who truly understood what Babbage was trying to do. And she was a woman working in a field, mathematics, that was almost entirely closed to women at the time, which makes her achievement all the more remarkable. Neither Babbage nor Lovelace lived to see anything like the analytical engine built. Lovelace died in 1852, at the age of 36, of cancer. Babbage died in 1871, an old man, still working on his designs, still certain that his machines could have changed the world, if only they had been built. For a long time, they were remembered as a historical curiosity, a pair of eccentrics who dreamed too far ahead of their time. But the ideas they set down on paper did not die. The plans for the difference engine were eventually proven sound. In the 1990s, the Science Museum in London built a working difference engine using Babbage's original designs and the materials and techniques that would have been available to him. It worked perfectly, calculating and printing the tables he had promised, a century and a half after he first imagined it. And the analytical engine, the dream of a programmable computer, would eventually be realized, not in brass and steam, but in vacuum tubes and then in silicon, by people who had read Babbage's papers or heard his story and understood, as he had understood, that a machine could follow instructions, could decide, could, in a limited way, think. And so, as we let this part of the story settle, we can picture the two of them in a London drawing room, Babbage with his drawings spread out on a table, Lovelace leaning forward, asking questions, making notes, the gaslight flickering on the walls. The analytical engine is not there, not in the room, not anywhere in the world. It is only an idea, a pattern of thought, a vision of what might be. But ideas, once they are clearly expressed, have a way of outlasting the people who thought them. The difference engine and the analytical engine were never built in their time, but the notion of a programmable machine, the notion that calculation could be automated, that instructions could be stored on cards and fed into a mechanism, that a machine could do not just one thing but anything that could be described precisely enough, that notion was now in the world, and it would not go away. The next step, the step that would take these ideas from the drawing room to the factory floor and the government office, was waiting just around the corner of the century, in the form of an American inventor and a census that took too long to count. But that is a story for the next quiet hour. For now, let the drawings rest. Let the voices fade. Let the gaslight dim. The machines are still unborn, still just lines on paper, and there is all the time in the world for them to grow real. The American inventor who picked up the thread that Babbage and Lovelace had left behind was not a mathematician, not a philosopher, not a dreamer of steam-powered futures. He was a practical man, an engineer, someone who looked at a problem and saw a way to solve it with the tools at hand. His name was Herman Hollerith, and he was born in Buffalo, New York, in 1860, the son of German immigrants. He studied engineering at the Columbia School of Mines, and after graduating he took a job with the United States Census Office, the government bureau responsible for counting the population of the country every 10 years, as the Constitution required. It was there, in the early 1880s, that he encountered the problem that would shape the rest of his life. The census of 1880 had taken nearly 8 years to count. The data from the census had been gathered by hand, tabulated by hand, copied by hand, checked by hand, and the work had stretched on so long that the results were nearly useless by the time they were published. The country was growing fast, and the census of 1890 was going to be even larger. If nothing changed, there was a real possibility that the 1890 census would not be finished before the 1900 census was supposed to begin. The system was breaking under its own weight. The human computers, the army of clerks with their paper and pencils, could not keep up. Hollerith thought about this problem for a long time. He had seen the punched cards of the Jacquard loom, or at least he had read about them and understood the principle. He had also seen something else that gave him an idea. On a train trip, he had watched a conductor punch tickets, marking each passenger's ticket with a pattern of holes that indicated things like the passenger's height, hair color, eye color, and destination, so that the ticket could not be transferred to another person. The holes were a code, a way of storing information on a small piece of cardboard. Hollerith put these two ideas together, the punched cards of the loom and the punched tickets of the railroad, and he designed a system for tabulating census data. His idea was simple and powerful. Every person counted in the census would be represented by a single card, a stiff piece of paper about the size of a dollar bill. On that card, a grid of possible positions would be printed. Each position stood for a piece of information, male or female, married or single, native-born or immigrant, and so on. The census taker would punch a hole at the appropriate position for each person. Then the cards would be fed into a machine that Hollerith designed, a tabulating machine that could read the holes and count them. The machine worked by pressing a set of pins against each card. Where there was a hole, the pin passed through and made contact with a small cup of mercury, completing an electrical circuit. That circuit advanced a counter by 1. Where there was no hole, the pin was stopped, and no circuit was completed, and no count was added. It was, in its essence, exactly the same principle as the Jacquard loom, the same idea of reading a pattern of holes with a set of mechanical feelers, but applied not to the lifting of threads, but to the counting of people. The system was fast, far faster than any human clerk could hope to be. And it was flexible. The cards could be sorted, stacked, and fed through the machine in different ways to answer different questions. How many people live in each state? How many are between the ages of 20 and 30? How many are farmers or factory workers or school teachers? Each question could be answered by running the cards through the machine with the counters set up to count the right holes. The machine did not calculate in the way that Pascal's or Leibniz's machines calculated. It did not add or subtract numbers that were given to it. It simply counted. But counting is the most basic form of arithmetic, and the census was, at its heart, a giant counting problem. The machine solved it. Hollerith tested his system on some smaller tabulation jobs, and then, in 1890, he won the contract to process the United States Census. The results were remarkable. The census counted more than 62 million people, a huge increase over the previous census, and the tabulation was completed in about 2.5 years, a fraction of the time it would have taken by hand. The machine had proved itself. The government saved money, the data was available while it was still relevant, and Herman Hollerith found himself at the center of a new industry. He founded a company, the Tabulating Machine Company, to sell his machines and his cards to other government agencies, to businesses, to railroads, to anyone who had large amounts of information to count and sort. His company grew, and it merged with other companies, and eventually, in 1924, it became the International Business Machines Corporation, known around the world by 3 letters, IBM. That name will appear again later in our story, because IBM would become one of the central players in the development of electronic computing in the decades that followed. But the roots of that vast company lie here, in the punched cards of the 1890 census, in the simple idea of representing information as wholes in a piece of cardboard. The punched card, once it had proved its value in the census, spread rapidly. Businesses adopted it for accounting, for inventory, for payroll. Government agencies adopted it for taxes, for records, for statistics. The card itself became standardized. The most common format, the one that would dominate the industry for decades, was a rectangle of stiff paper about 7 3/8 inches long and 3 1/4 inches high, divided into 80 vertical columns and 12 horizontal rows. Each column could hold one character, one letter or number or symbol, represented by a pattern of small rectangular holes punched in the column. The card could hold 80 characters in total, about the length of a short sentence. That may not sound like much, but stacks of these cards, thousands of them, tens of thousands of them, could hold enormous amounts of data, and the machines that read them could process that data with a speed and accuracy that no human workforce could match. The punched card became the standard medium for storing and moving information in the world of business and government. It was the database of its age, and the rooms full of machines that sorted, collated, and tabulated those cards were the data centers of their time, humming and clattering with the work of turning wholes into numbers, numbers into reports, reports into decisions. This is a quiet turning point in the story we are tracing. Up until now, computing had been an invention, a project of solitary geniuses and visionary dreamers, a thing of drawing rooms and workshops and unfinished prototypes. With Hollerith and his census machines, computing became a tool. It became a product that could be bought and sold and put to work. It became ordinary. The punched card was not glamorous. It was not the stuff of poetry, like Ada Lovelace's vision of a machine that might compose music. It was a piece of cardboard with holes in it, the same size as the dollar bills that workers received in their pay envelopes, which meant that it fit neatly into the safes and drawers and storage boxes that had been designed for money. It was practical, industrial, and a little dull. But that practicality is exactly what made it so important. The punched card took the ideas of Babbage and Lovelace, the idea of a programmable machine, the idea of storing instructions and data on a physical medium, and it turned those ideas into something that actually worked, something that could be manufactured and sold and used by people who had no interest in the theory behind it. The card was the bridge between the dream of the analytical engine and the reality of the modern computer. And the bridge held for a very long time. Punched cards were still in widespread use through the 1960s and 1970s. Even into the 1980s, you could still find them in some offices and schools, a fading reminder of the era when information was something you could hold in your hand, a stack of cards that you could shuffle and sort and drop, if you were not careful, scattering your data across the floor in a disaster that every programmer of the mid-20th century knew and dreaded. The cards were not perfect. They could tear, they could jam the machines, they could get out of order, but they were reliable enough and standardized enough and cheap enough that they served as the foundation of the information age for the better part of a century. So what should we take from this chapter of the story, here in the quiet dark? It is not that Herman Hollerith was a genius on the level of Babbage or Lovelace. He was not. He was an engineer, a problem solver, a man who saw a bottleneck and found a way to break it. But his contribution was just as essential as the contributions of the visionaries who came before him. Ideas, no matter how brilliant, do not change the world by themselves. They have to be built, tested, refined, and put to work. They have to be turned into products that people can buy and use. Hollerith did that. He took the punched card from the weaving shed and the railroad car and made it into a tool for counting a nation. And in doing so, he set in motion a chain of events that would lead in time to the electronic computer, to the internet, to the phone on your nightstand. He did not know where the road was leading, No one ever does. But he took the next step, the practical, unglamorous, essential next step, and the story moved forward. And now, as we let our breathing slow and our thoughts drift, we can picture those early census machines, the Hollerith tabulators, lined up in a government office in Washington, their metal counters clicking as the cards run through, one after another, a soft, rhythmic sound, almost like a heartbeat. The census of 1890 is being counted. The numbers are adding up, state by state, city by city, person by person, each one a hole in a card. Each card a life reduced to a pattern of openings and closings that a machine can read. It is not poetry, it is not romance. It is the quiet, steady work of turning the messiness of human existence into orderly rows of data that can be counted and sorted and understood. That work, as much as any equation or any invention, is what made the modern world. The cards are still now. The machines are silent. The census is long since finished. The people counted long since gone, but the idea of the card, the idea of storing information in a form a machine can read, that idea is still with us, still working, still ticking away quietly in the background of everything we do. Let it rest. Let it all rest. The next step, the step that would take these humble counting machines and turn them into something that could reason, that could follow logic, that could, in a sense, think, is waiting for us just up ahead, in the realm of pure mathematics and electrical circuits. But there is no hurry. The night is still long. The story will wait. While Herman Hollerith's punched cards were clattering through tabulating machines in Washington, a completely different kind of work was underway in the quiet studies of mathematicians. This work had no gears, no levers, no cards, no counters. It was done with pencil and paper, with symbols written on a page, with ideas so abstract that they seemed to have no connection to the physical world at all. And yet, these abstract ideas would turn out to be just as important to the story of computing as any machine ever built. They would provide the deep logic, the fundamental language, that all later computers would speak. The first of these thinkers was an Englishman named George Boole, born in 1815 in the town of Lincoln, the son of a shoemaker. Boole was largely self-taught. His family could not afford to send him to a proper school for long, so he taught himself Latin, Greek, French, German, and mathematics, reading whatever books he could get his hands on while working as a schoolteacher to support his family. He was a quiet, patient, deeply thoughtful man, and in the middle of the 1800s he began to write about a subject that seemed, at the time, to have no practical use at all. Boole wanted to understand the laws of thought. He wanted to take the way that human beings reason, the way we draw conclusions from facts, and express it in the form of mathematics. This was not a new ambition. Leibniz, more than a century earlier, had dreamed of something similar. But Boole was the one who actually did it, who created a system of mathematical logic that was clear, consistent, and powerful. In Boole's system, there are only two values, true and false, 1 and 0, yes and no. Every statement is either true or false. There is no in-between, no maybe, no partly true. Once you accept this, you can begin to combine statements using simple operations. You can say that something is true and something else is also true. You can say that something is true or something else is true. You can say that something is not true. These three little words, and, or, not, are the building blocks of everything that follows. Boole showed that you could write these operations down using symbols, just like the symbols for addition and subtraction, and that you could manipulate them according to precise rules. The result was a kind of algebra, not of numbers, but of truth and falsehood, a way of reasoning that could be written out step by step and checked for errors. Boole published his most important work, An Investigation of the Laws of Thought, in 1854, and for a long time it was considered a philosophical curiosity, a beautiful but useless piece of abstract reasoning. No one imagined that it would one day become the foundation of an entire industry, the logical backbone of every digital device on Earth. Boole himself died in 1864, walking to his university job in the rain, developing a fever that his weakened body could not fight off. He was 49 years old, and he had no idea what his work would one day make possible. The connection between Boole's abstract logic and the world of physical machines was made by another young man, an American named Claude Shannon, born in Michigan in 1916. Shannon was the kind of person who loved to tinker, to take things apart, to see how they worked. He studied electrical engineering and mathematics, and in 1937, as a graduate student at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, he wrote a master's thesis that would quietly change the world. Shannon's insight was simple and profound. He realized that electrical circuits, the arrangements of wires and switches that control the flow of electricity, could be used to represent the logical operations that Boole had described. A switch can be either on or off. On and off are two states, just like true and false, just like 1 and 0. If you arrange switches in a certain way, the flow of electricity through them will follow the rules of Boolean logic. A circuit with two switches in a row is on only if the first switch and the second switch are both on. A circuit with two switches in parallel is on if the first switch or the second switch is on. A circuit with a switch that is normally closed and opens when activated represents not. Out of these simple building blocks, you can build circuits that perform any logical operation, any decision that can be reduced to a series of yes or no questions. Shannon's thesis showed, in rigorous detail, how to do this. It was a bridge between the abstract world of mathematics and the concrete world of wires and switches and electrical currents. The paper was called A Symbolic Analysis of Relay and Switching Circuits, and it has been called one of the most important master's theses ever written. It meant that the logic of true and false could be built, physically, out of electrical parts. It meant that a machine could reason, not by thinking, but by letting electricity flow through a carefully designed network of switches. And now we come to the third figure in this chapter of the story, a young English mathematician named Alan Turing. He was born in London in 1912, and from an early age he showed a remarkable gift for mathematics, and a certain independence of mind, a willingness to follow his own thoughts wherever they led. In 1936, when he was just 24 years old, Turing published a paper with a title that sounded abstract and technical, but contained an idea that would become one of the cornerstones of computer science. The paper was called On Computable Numbers, with an application to the Entscheidungsproblem, a German word meaning the decision problem, a question about whether there is a mechanical procedure that can determine the truth or falsehood of any mathematical statement. To answer this question, Turing proposed something he imagined as a kind of very simple machine. This machine was not meant to be built. It was a thought experiment, a way of reasoning about what it means to compute something. The machine Turing described, which we now call a Turing machine, is incredibly simple. It consists of a long strip of paper divided into squares, like a tape. The tape can be as long as it needs to be, and each square can hold a single symbol, such as a 1 or a 0, or be left blank. The machine has a head that can read the symbol on the current square, write a new symbol, and then move one square to the left or one square to the right. The machine also has a set of rules, a table of instructions that tells it what to do, based on what symbol it reads and what state it is in. That is all. A tape, a head, and a table of rules, nothing more. And yet, Turing argued, this simple machine could, in principle, compute anything that could be computed at all. If a problem could be broken down into a series of precise, mechanical steps, a Turing machine could solve it. It might take a very long time. The tape might need to be impossibly long, but in theory, the machine could do it. This was a profound insight. It gave a precise mathematical definition of what it means for something to be computable. It meant that all computing machines, no matter how complex, no matter how fast, were in a deep sense equivalent to this simple imaginary device. If a Turing machine could not solve a problem, then no machine could. The paper also showed that there are some problems that cannot be solved by any mechanical procedure, some questions that no computer, however powerful, can ever answer. But that is a deeper topic than we need to explore tonight. The key point, the point that matters for our story, is that Turing had described a universal machine, a machine that could carry out any computation that could be precisely described. His imaginary machine was the theoretical model for the general-purpose computer. It did not need to know in advance what problem it would solve. It just needed to be given the right tape, the right set of symbols, the right table of rules. Change the rules, change the symbols on the tape, and the same machine could do anything from adding two numbers to calculating the orbit of a planet. The universality was the magic. One machine, many tasks, simply by changing the instructions. These three men, Boole, Shannon, and Turing, working decades apart, each contributed a piece of the logical foundation on which all modern computers rest. Boole showed that reasoning could be reduced to a simple algebra of true and false. Shannon showed that this algebra could be built out of electrical switches, that the laws of thought could be wired into a circuit. Turing showed that a very simple machine, following a set of rules, could in principle carry out any computation that could be defined. None of them built a working computer. Boole died before electrical switches were even imagined. Shannon's work was used to design better telephone switching systems before it was applied to computers. Turing's machine existed only on paper, a thought experiment, a way of clarifying what computation meant. But their ideas, once they were out in the world, took root. They gave the next generation of builders, the engineers and the mathematicians, who would assemble the first real electronic computers, the conceptual tools they needed. The logic was ready. The circuits were understood. The theory of what a computer could be was complete. All that remained was to build it, to take the abstract ideas and make them out of metal and glass and electricity, to turn the logic into a machine that would actually run. And that step, the step from theory to reality, was about to be taken, driven by the terrible urgency of the Second World War, by the need to break codes and calculate firing tables and solve problems that human computers, however skilled, could not solve fast enough. But that is the next part of the story, the part we will come to when we are ready. For now, it is enough to let these three quiet thinkers rest, each in their own time, each with their own piece of the puzzle. Boole, writing his symbols in the gaslight. Shannon, sketching circuits in his notebook. Turing, imagining a tape stretching out to infinity, a machine reading and writing and moving, one square at a time, forever. The logic is patient, the circuits are silent, the tape is blank, waiting for the morning, waiting for the first real machines to bring these ideas to life. But there is no rush. The night is deep and still, and the story will continue when it is time. The Second World War, which began in 1939 and lasted until 1945, was a war fought with tanks and planes and ships and soldiers, but it was also a war fought with information. Each side tried to keep its own messages secret while trying to read the messages of the enemy. The Germans used a machine called Enigma to scramble their communications. The Enigma machine looked a little like a typewriter, but inside it had a set of rotating wheels and a tangle of electrical wiring. When the operator pressed a letter on the keyboard, the machine sent the electrical signal through the wheels, scrambling it according to the settings of those wheels, and a different letter lit up on a panel. If you pressed the letter A, the machine might light up the letter Q. Press A again with the wheels in different positions, and it might light up the letter T. The code was enormously complex, with billions of possible settings, and the Germans believed it was unbreakable. They relied on Enigma for their naval communications, their military orders, their secret intelligence. And for a time, they were right. The code could not be broken by human computers, no matter how many of them worked on it, no matter how many hours they spent. The mathematics was too vast, the possibilities too many. In Britain, a group of the country's most brilliant minds was gathered at a country estate called Bletchley Park, about 50 miles north of London. Their mission was to break the German codes, and among them was Alan Turing, the young mathematician who had written the paper about the imaginary machine that could compute anything. Now, a few years later, he was not imagining machines. He was helping to design real ones. The machine he contributed to most directly was called the bombe, a name borrowed from an earlier Polish device that had first cracked an earlier version of Enigma. The British bombe was not a computer in the modern sense. It did not have a memory. It did not run a stored program. It was an electromechanical device, a large cabinet filled with rotating drums and electrical circuits, and it was designed to do one specific thing. It searched through the possible settings of the Enigma machine, testing one after another at high speed, looking for settings that would turn an intercepted German message into something that made sense. It was, in essence, a machine for eliminating impossibilities. The bombe would run through a set of assumptions, and if the assumptions led to a contradiction, the machine would stop, and the operators would know that those settings were wrong. By running many bombes over and over, the team at Bletchley Park was able to narrow down the possible settings until only the correct ones remained. Then the intercepted messages could be decoded, read, and passed on to the British commanders. The intelligence gathered this way was called Ultra, and it was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. It gave the Allies a window into German plans, and it saved lives, though exactly how many is impossible to say. The work at Bletchley Park remained secret for decades after the war ended. The machines were dismantled. The papers were classified. Turing himself, in the years after the war, was prosecuted for his private life, treated cruelly by the country he had served, and died in 1954 at the age of 41. His contributions to computing and to the war effort were only fully recognized much later. But Bletchley Park was not the only place where the war was driving the development of computing machines. Across the Atlantic in the United States, another massive project was underway at the University of Pennsylvania's Moore School of Electrical Engineering. This project was not about code breaking, it was about artillery. When a gun fires a shell, the shell travels through the air in a curved path, affected by gravity, by wind, by air resistance, by the rotation of the earth. To hit a target, the gunners need to know what angle to fire the gun, and how much powder to use, and how to account for all the variables that will affect the shell's flight. These calculations were done using tables called firing tables, which listed the correct settings for every combination of gun, shell, range, and weather conditions. The tables were calculated by human computers, mostly women with mathematical training, working with mechanical calculators. But the work was slow, far too slow for the needs of a global war. A single firing table could take weeks to calculate. By the time it was ready, the gun might already be in a different theater of war, facing different conditions. To solve this problem, the United States Army funded the construction of a machine called ENIAC, which stood for Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer. It was completed in 1945, just as the war was ending, and it was one of the first general-purpose electronic computers ever built. ENIAC was enormous. It filled a large room at the Moore School, a room 40 feet wide and 30 feet deep, and it weighed about 30 tons. It used around 17,000 vacuum tubes, the glowing glass bulbs that were used in radios and amplifiers of the time, each one acting as a tiny switch that could be turned on or off by an electrical signal. Because vacuum tubes are fragile, like light bulbs, several of them burned out every day, and the operators had to find the failed tube and replace it to keep the machine running. ENIAC did not use punched cards for its main programming, or at least not at first. To tell ENIAC what to do, the operators had to physically rewire it, plugging cables into different sockets on large panels, like an old telephone switchboard. Changing the program could take days, but once it was set up, ENIAC was fast, far faster than any mechanical calculator. It could perform thousands of calculations per second, a speed that seemed almost magical at the time. It could calculate a firing table in hours, not weeks. It could do in a day what a room full of human computers would take a month to finish. ENIAC was not a comfortable machine. It hummed and crackled and gave off a great deal of heat. The room had to be air-conditioned to keep the vacuum tubes from overheating. The women who programmed it, including Jean Jennings Bartik and Betty Holberton and several others, had to learn the machine's wiring and logic from the ground up, because there was no manual, no textbook, no established practice for programming an electronic computer. They figured it out as they went, and their contributions, like those of the Bletchley Park codebreakers, were largely overlooked for many years. The story of early computing is full of people whose work was essential, but whose names were forgotten or pushed aside, and the recovery of those names is still ongoing, a slow and careful work of historical scholarship. After the war, ENIAC was used for other purposes. It did calculations for the design of the hydrogen bomb, it did weather prediction, it did mathematical research. It showed, beyond any doubt, that electronic computing was practical, that the speed of electricity could be harnessed to do in seconds what had always taken human beings hours or days or years. But ENIAC also had a fundamental limitation, a limitation that pointed directly toward the next big idea. Every time you wanted to give ENIAC a new problem to solve, you had to rewire it. The machine itself was fast, but the setup was slow. The program was not inside the machine, it was in the arrangement of cables and switches, an arrangement that had to be changed by hand, and changed back, and checked for errors. The machine was a brilliant proof of concept, but it was not yet a practical tool for everyday use. The next step, the step that would turn electronic computers from wartime curiosities into the foundation of a new era, was to find a way to store the program inside the machine, to treat the instructions as data, so that changing the program would be as simple as reading a new set of instructions into the machine's memory. That step was already being thought about, even as ENIAC was being built. The idea was in the air, in the notes and conversations of the people who had worked on these wartime projects, and it would soon be realized in a series of small, quiet breakthroughs in England and in the United States in the years just after the war. But the machines built for war had done their part. They had shown that electronic computing was possible, that it was fast, that it was useful, and that governments were willing to pay for it. The age of the electronic computer had begun. The room-sized machines with their glowing tubes and their clicking relays were the ancestors of every device that now sits quietly in the palm of a hand. And as we drift a little deeper into rest, we can picture those early machines, the Bombays turning at Bletchley Park, the ENIAC humming in its room in Philadelphia, the women and men who tended them moving quietly through the glow of the tubes, doing the work that would shape the world we live in now. The war is over. The machines are quiet. The secrets they kept are no longer secret. And the next idea, the idea that would let a computer remember its own instructions, is waiting just up ahead. But that is a story for another breath, another moment of the long, slow night. The limitation of ENIAC, the thing that made it so cumbersome despite its speed, was that its program lived outside the machine. To change what ENIAC did, you had to change the machine itself, moving cables from one socket to another, setting switches, reconfiguring the physical pathways that the electrical signals would follow. This was slow, tedious work, and it meant that the machine spent a great deal of time idle, waiting for its human operators to finish rewiring it. The people who designed ENIAC understood this limitation. Even before the machine was finished, they were thinking about what would come next, about how to build a computer that could hold its instructions inside itself, in its own memory, where they could be changed as easily as the data the machine processed. This idea, the idea of storing the program in the same memory as the data, is one of the most important concepts in the history of computing. It is so fundamental that nearly every computer built since the late 1940s has followed this same basic pattern, and it is often associated with a man named John von Neumann, though the full story, as is so often the case, is more complicated than a single name. John von Neumann was a Hungarian-born mathematician who had moved to the United States in the 1930s. He was widely regarded as one of the most brilliant minds of his generation, a man who could do advanced calculus in his head while driving to work, and who made important contributions to fields as diverse as quantum mechanics, game theory, and the design of nuclear weapons. During the war, he had been involved in the Manhattan Project, the effort to build the atomic bomb, and he had become interested in the problem of high-speed computation, which was essential for the complex calculations that bomb design required. He visited the ENIAC project in 1944 and saw the machine in its final stages of construction. He understood immediately both its power and its limitation. In 1945, he wrote a document called The First Draft of a Report on the EDVAC, which laid out the logical design for a new kind of computer. EDVAC stood for Electronic Discrete Variable Automatic Computer, and it was intended to be the successor to ENIAC. The report described a machine that would store its program internally, in a memory that could hold both the instructions and the numbers the instructions would work on. The instructions would be represented in the same form as the data, as patterns of ones and zeros, and the machine would read them, decode them, and carry them out, one after another, without anyone having to touch a cable or throw a switch. This was the stored program concept, and it was a profound shift. It meant that a computer could be a truly general-purpose machine. You did not have to rewire it to change its task. You simply wrote a new program, fed it into the machine's memory, and let the machine run. The program became something that could be written, copied, shared, and revised, just like any other piece of writing. It became software, a word that would come into use later, as distinct from hardware, the physical machine itself. The same hardware could run an endless variety of software, and that flexibility is the reason that computers have spread into every corner of modern life. A single device can be a calculator, a typewriter, a telephone, a map, a library, a television, all depending on what instructions it is running at the moment. The stored program concept made that possible. But the report that von Neumann wrote, influential as it was not the only source of the stored program idea. The concept was in the air at the time, circulating among the small community of people who were building the first electronic computers. Some of the people who had worked on ENIAC, including J. Presper Eckert and John Malkley, the lead engineers, later argued that they had discussed the idea of a stored program well before von Neumann arrived on the scene. In England, the team that had built the Colossus machines for code breaking at Bletchley Park, a project so secret that it would not be made public for decades, had also explored some of the same ground. The exact priority of ideas is difficult to untangle, and historians still debate the details. The important point is not who thought of it first, but that the idea was realized, that multiple groups, working in different places, converged on the same solution. It was an idea whose time had come. The first machine to actually run a stored program, in a small and limited way, was built at the University of Manchester in England. It was called the Manchester Baby, or the Small-Scale Experimental Machine, and it first ran a program on June 21, 1948. The Baby was not a large or powerful machine. Its memory could hold about 1,024 bits, a bit being the smallest unit of information, a single 1 or 0. To put that in perspective, a modern phone can hold many billions of bits in its memory, and the document holding this script is many millions of bits in size. The Baby was tiny by any modern standard, but it proved the concept. It stored a program, it read the program, and it executed the instructions, producing a result. In this case, the program found the highest proper divisor of a number, a small mathematical task, but it worked. The stored program computer was no longer a theoretical idea. It was a real machine, humming in a laboratory, doing actual computation under the control of its own internal instructions. From there, the stored program design spread rapidly. The Manchester team went on to build a larger machine, the Manchester Mark I, which became the basis for the Ferranti Mark I, one of the first commercially available general-purpose computers. At Cambridge University, another machine called the EDSAC, built by a team led by Maurice Wilkes, ran its first program in May of 1949. EDSAC was heavily influenced by von Neumann's report, and it was one of the first practical stored program computers to go into regular service, used by researchers for a wide range of scientific calculations. In the United States, the EDVAC project itself was delayed by disputes and departures, but it eventually became operational in 1951, and by then, the stored program idea had become the standard pattern for computer design. The days of rewiring a machine for each new job were over. The age of software had begun. The stored program concept is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is easy to take it for granted now, when every device we use is a stored program computer. But think about what it actually means. A computer is a machine made of metal and plastic and silicon. It is a physical object with a fixed structure. And yet, by changing the pattern of ones and zeros in its memory, you can make that machine do entirely different things. You can make it edit a photograph, or play a song, or send a message across the world, or calculate the path of a spacecraft. The machine does not change. The hardware is the same. The transformation is in the software, the stored instructions, the invisible pattern that tells the hardware what to do. This is the direct descendant of the punched cards of the Jacquard loom, the swappable instructions that told the loom which threads to lift. The cards are gone, replaced by electrical charges in tiny memory cells, but the principle is exactly the same. The machine is told what to do by a set of instructions that can be changed at will. The program is data, and data is the program. They live together in the same memory, and the computer does not know the difference. It just reads the next instruction, carries it out, and moves on. And so, as we let the quiet settle around us once more, we can picture that first small machine at Manchester, the baby, running its little program in 1948. The room is dim, perhaps, with the green glow of a cathode ray tube used to display the contents of the memory, a pattern of dots that represents the ones and zeros of the program. The engineers are watching, checking that the machine is doing what it should. The program runs, step by step, and after a few seconds it halts, and the answer is there, in the memory, ready to be read. It is a small moment, a moment that would not have seemed world-changing at the time, but it was a hinge in history. The stored program computer had worked. The pattern was set. Every computer since, from the mainframes of the 1950s to the phone beside your bed, has followed the same basic architecture, the same division of labor between memory and processor, the same flow of instructions from storage to execution. The details have changed over and over, but the idea remains. The program is inside the machine now. It has been there ever since, and it will stay there, quietly running, while we drift away into sleep. The baby is quiet. The Manchester laboratory is dark. The long line of stored program computers stretches out from that moment into the future, an unbroken chain of instructions read and executed, one after another, through all the decades that follow. But that is a story for the next part of the night. For now, let the program rest. Let the memory hold its pattern of ones and zeros. The machine is ready, waiting, and so are we, breathing slowly, letting the night carry us forward. The stored program computers of the late 1940s and early 1950s were marvels of engineering, but they were also enormous, fragile, and enormously expensive. They relied on vacuum tubes, those glowing glass bulbs that controlled the flow of electricity by heating a metal filament until it gave off electrons. A vacuum tube could act as a switch, turning a current on or off, or as an amplifier, making a weak signal stronger. But vacuum tubes had serious drawbacks. They were large, each one about the size of a thumb or larger. They ran hot, because the filament inside had to be heated to make them work. They burned out regularly, like light bulbs, and had to be replaced. A machine like ENIAC, with its thousands of tubes, might have several failures a day. Finding and replacing the dead tube was a constant chore, and the heat given off by all those glowing filaments required special air conditioning, even in winter. Computers were housed in specially built rooms, attended by teams of engineers, and they consumed electricity on a scale that made them practical only for governments, large universities, and the biggest corporations. They were, in a very real sense, dinosaurs. Impressive, but doomed to be replaced by something smaller and more efficient. That something arrived in 1947 from a laboratory in New Jersey. Bell Telephone Laboratories, known as Bell Labs, was one of the great research institutions of the 20th century, a place where scientists and engineers were given the freedom to pursue fundamental research. A team there, led by William Shockley, along with John Bardeen and Walter Brattain, had been working on the behavior of electricity in solid materials, a field called solid-state physics. They were looking for a way to control electrical current without using a vacuum tube, without the heat and the fragility and the bulk. In December of 1947, they succeeded. They built a tiny device made from a crystal of germanium, a grayish-white element, with fine gold wires touching its surface at precise points. When a small current was applied to one wire, it controlled a larger current flowing through the crystal between the other two wires. The device could act as a switch, turning a current on or off, just like a vacuum tube. But it did not need to be heated. It was solid, a tiny slab of crystal with wires attached, and it used far less power. They called it the transistor, from the words transfer and resistor, and it would change the world. Bardeen, Brattain, and Shockley shared the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1956 for their invention. A transistor, in its simplest description, is a tiny switch with no moving parts. It has three connections, called the emitter, the base, and the collector, though the names are not important for our story. What matters is that a very small current applied to the base can control a much larger current flowing from the collector to the emitter. If the small current is on, the large current flows. If the small current is off, the large current stops. On and off, 1 and 0, true and false. The transistor was a solid, reliable, cool-running way to do the same Boolean logic that Shannon had shown could be done with relays and vacuum tubes. But transistors were not just a little smaller than vacuum tubes. They were vastly smaller. A single transistor could be made smaller than a grain of rice. And because they did not burn out like vacuum tubes, they could be packed together in large numbers without the constant maintenance that early computers required. The age of the transistor had begun, and with it, the age of computers that could be built smaller, faster, and cheaper than ever before. The first transistorized computers appeared in the late 1950s and early 1960s. They were still large by modern standards, still filling cabinets and requiring special rooms, but they were far more reliable and used less power than their vacuum tube predecessors. The military, always hungry for computing power, funded much of the early development. Transistorized computers were used in missiles, in aircraft, in early warning systems, anywhere that reliability and small size mattered. But the real transformation came with the next step in miniaturization, a step that took the transistor and multiplied it by the thousands, then the millions, then the billions. This was the integrated circuit, a way of building not just one transistor, but many transistors, along with the resistors and capacitors and other components they needed, all on a single small chip of silicon. The idea was developed independently by two men, Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments and Robert Noyce at Fairchild Semiconductor, in the late 1950s. Kilby built the first working integrated circuit in 1958, and Noyce developed an improved version shortly afterward using silicon, the material that gives its name to Silicon Valley, the region south of San Francisco where so many technology companies would eventually cluster. An integrated circuit, or chip, is a tiny flat piece of silicon, a material that is a semiconductor, meaning it can be made to conduct electricity under some conditions and block it under others. By carefully adding impurities to the silicon in precise patterns, engineers can create transistors and other components directly on the surface of the chip. The patterns are drawn using light, a process called photolithography, and then etched into the silicon with chemicals. The result is a complete electronic circuit, smaller than a fingernail, containing dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of transistors, all connected by thin metal lines laid down on the surface of the chip. The integrated circuit meant that computers could shrink again, from cabinets full of separate transistor boards to a single box containing a few chips. And the chips kept getting more complex. In 1965, Gordon Moore, one of the founders of Intel, the company that Noyce helped create, observed that the number of transistors on a chip seemed to double about every 2 years. This observation, now called Moore's law, is not a law of physics but a pattern that held true for decades, and it meant that computing power kept growing at an extraordinary rate while the cost of that power kept falling. By the mid-1960s, computers had become reliable and affordable enough that businesses were buying them in large numbers. The leading company in this market was IBM, the same company that had grown out of Herman Hollerith's punched card tabulating business. IBM produced a series of mainframe computers, large machines that sat in air-conditioned rooms and were tended by a professional staff. In 1964, IBM announced the System/360, a family of computers that were all compatible with one another. A program written for a small System 360 model could run on a large one and vice versa. This was a significant change. Before the System/360, each new computer model was often a one-of-a-kind design, and software written for one machine would not run on another. The System/360 established the idea of a compatible family of computers, where customers could upgrade to a larger machine without having to rewrite all their software. It was a commercial success, and it cemented IBM's dominance of the computer industry for the next 2 decades. The machines were still large, still housed in special rooms, still operated by specialists in white coats. But they were no longer experimental curiosities. They were tools, essential to the running of banks, airlines, government agencies, and large corporations. Computing had become an industry. And all the while, the transistors were shrinking. The integrated circuits were growing denser. The same forces that had turned a room-sized computer into a cabinet were now turning the cabinet into a box that could fit on a desk. The stage was being set for the next great shift. The shift from the computer as an institutional tool to the computer as a personal device, something an ordinary person might have in their home. But that is the next part of the story, and we can let it rest for now. For now, it is enough to think about the vacuum tube and the transistor, the glowing glass bulb and the tiny speck of silicon, and to appreciate the quiet miracle of miniaturization that has taken place over the past 70 years. The switch that once filled a thumb-sized glass bulb now fits by the billions on a chip smaller than your fingernail. Each switch is still doing what Claude Shannon described in 1937. Each switch is still making a decision between on and off, 1 and 0, true and false. The logic has not changed. The ideas are the same ideas that Boole wrote down in the gaslight, that Turing imagined on his infinite tape. Only the physical form has shrunk, over and over, until the computer that once filled a room now rests, silently, in the palm of your hand. The transistors are sleeping now, dark and cool, waiting for the morning. And so, I think, are we. By the early 1970s, computers had become essential tools for governments, universities, and large corporations. But they were not something an ordinary person would ever expect to own, or even touch. A computer was a thing you read about, a thing that filled a room, a thing that was operated by specialists in white coats who spoke a language of codes and commands that seemed impenetrable to outsiders. The idea that a computer might one day sit on a desk in a home, used by children for schoolwork or by adults for keeping track of household finances, would have seemed far-fetched, almost absurd. And yet, the forces that would make that possible were already at work. The integrated circuit, that tiny chip packed with transistors, was growing more powerful and less expensive every year. A new generation of electronics hobbyists, people who built radios and other gadgets for fun, was beginning to experiment with digital circuits. The stage was set for the computer to move out of the glass-walled data centers and into the wider world. The moment that is often cited as the start of that shift came in 1975, when a small company in Albuquerque, New Mexico, called MITS, which stood for Micro-Instrumentation and Telemetry Systems, announced a product called the Altair 8800. It was sold as a kit, a box of parts that the buyer would assemble at home, soldering the components onto circuit boards and wiring them together. The Altair did not look like a modern computer. It was a blue and gray box with a row of small toggle switches on the front and a panel of tiny red lights. To use it, you flipped the switches up and down to set a pattern of ones and zeros, loaded that pattern into the machine's memory, and then read the result by looking at the pattern of lights. There was no keyboard, no screen, no mouse. The Altair was, by modern standards, extremely limited. But it was a real computer, a stored program machine, built around a new kind of chip called a microprocessor, a single integrated circuit that contained the central processing unit, the brain of the computer, all on one small piece of silicon. The Altair used a microprocessor made by a young company called Intel, the Intel 8080, and it was, for the first time, a computer that an individual could afford. The kit cost a few $100s, a fraction of what any previous computer had cost. The announcement of the Altair 8800, published in the January 1975 issue of Popular Electronics magazine, had an effect that no one could have predicted. Orders poured in. Thousands of people, many of them electronics enthusiasts who had been waiting for exactly this kind of product, sent in their money and waited for their kits to arrive. The Altair was not practical for any serious work. It had very little memory, no permanent storage, and no easy way to get data in or out. But it proved that there was a demand for personal computing. It inspired a generation of hobbyists and entrepreneurs, people who looked at that box of switches and lights and saw the future. Among those people were two young men in California, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, who had been building and selling a small device that could make free long-distance phone calls, a mischievous project that they called the Blue Box. When they saw the Altair, they realized that the time for a real personal computer had arrived. Wozniak, the engineer of the pair, designed a machine that was more elegant and more capable than the Altair, with a keyboard for input and the ability to connect to a regular television set for a display. Jobs, the visionary, saw that the machine could be sold not just as a kit for hobbyists, but as a finished product, an appliance that an ordinary person could buy, take home, and use. They called their company Apple, and in 1977 they released the Apple II. The Apple II was a turning point. It was not a kit. It came fully assembled in a sleek beige plastic case that looked like it belonged in a home, not a laboratory. It had a keyboard built in. It plugged into a television set, and it could display color graphics, something that no other affordable computer could do at the time. It had slots inside where you could plug in extra circuit boards to add features, a design that encouraged other companies to make accessories for it. And it had a floppy disk drive, introduced a bit later, which meant that programs could be loaded from a small magnetic disk, rather than typed in by hand or read from a slow audio cassette tape. The Apple II was a success, selling first to hobbyists and then to schools, small businesses, and a growing number of home users. It helped establish the idea that a computer could be a consumer product, not just a tool for engineers. At around the same time, other companies were entering the market. Commodore, a company that had made calculators and office equipment, released the PET, which stood for Personal Electronic Transactor, also in 1977. Tandy, the parent company of the Radio Shack electronics stores, released the TRS-80, which was sold in thousands of Radio Shack locations across the United States. These early personal computers were still limited by modern standards, with tiny amounts of memory and simple, text-based displays. But they were real computers, and they were finding their way into more and more hands. People wrote programs for them. Small software companies sprang up to sell those programs. The first computer games appeared, simple things like text adventures and crude graphics, but they were a hint of what was to come. The personal computer industry was growing, but it was still fragmented. Each brand of computer had its own way of doing things, its own operating system, its own standards for how to store data on a disk or display characters on a screen. Software written for one machine would not run on another. This began to change in 1981 when IBM, the giant of the computer industry, the company whose mainframes had dominated the business world for 2 decades, decided to enter the personal computer market. The IBM personal computer, usually called the IBM PC, was not the most advanced machine of its time. It used the same Intel microprocessor that many other machines used, but IBM made a decision that would shape the industry for decades to come. They designed the PC using standard, off-the-shelf parts that anyone could buy, and they published the technical details so that other companies could make accessories and software for it. They also licensed the operating system, the core software that controlled the machine, from a small company called Microsoft, run by a young programmer named Bill Gates. Crucially, IBM allowed Microsoft to sell that operating system, which was called MS-DOS, to other computer makers as well. This decision, in combination with the open design of the PC hardware, meant that other companies could make machines that worked just like the IBM PC, machines that could run the same software and use the same accessories. These compatible machines, often called clones, were made by companies like Compaq, Dell, and many others. Because they were all built from the same standard parts and ran the same Microsoft operating system, software written for one machine would work on any of them. The market for personal computers grew rapidly, and the prices fell. By the mid-1980s, the personal computer had become a common tool in offices and a familiar sight in homes. The computer was no longer a mysterious machine behind glass. It was a beige box on a desk, with a keyboard and a glowing screen, waiting for someone to type a command or load a program. Before this era, almost no ordinary household had a reason to own a computer. A computer was something a business might buy for accounting, or a university might use for research. But by the mid-1980s, computers were being used for writing letters, for playing games, for managing household budgets, for education. They were not yet as essential as they would become. The internet had not yet entered most homes. The graphical interfaces that we now take for granted were still being developed. But the shift had happened. The computer had become personal. It had moved from the institution to the individual, from the expert to the amateur, from the room to the desk. The Altair 8800, with its toggle switches and blinking lights, was a distant ancestor of the machine that would one day sit in nearly every home, but the line of descent was direct. The hobbyists who assembled those kits, the young companies that sprang up to serve them, the giant that belatedly entered the market and standardized it, all of them played a part in making the computer a personal thing, a thing you could own, a thing you could use without a degree in engineering. And so, as we let our eyes rest and our breathing slow, we can picture that row of early machines, the Altair, the Apple II, the IBM PC, sitting quietly on desks in darkened rooms. Their screens are dark. Their keyboards are still. The programs that ran on them, the simple games and the word processors and the spreadsheets, are stored away on floppy disks that no one reads anymore. But they are the ancestors of the device that now rests beside your bed, the device that carries more power than any of them could have dreamed of. The personal computer revolution is over now, long over, a settled chapter of history. But the energy of that time, the sense of discovery and possibility, still echoes faintly in the machines we use today. The computer is personal now, so personal that it fits in a pocket, so personal that it sleeps beside you while you sleep. And as the night deepens, we can let those early machines rest. Their switches flipped one last time, their screens fading to black, their fans spinning down into silence. The story is not over. There is still the network to come, the web, the great connection of everything to everything else. But that is for the next quiet hour. For now, the personal computer is still, and so are we, drifting gently on the edge of sleep. The personal computers of the late 1970s and early 1980s were powerful tools, but they were not easy to use. When you turned on an Apple II or an IBM PC, you were greeted not by a colorful screen full of icons and pictures, but by a blinking cursor on a dark screen, waiting for you to type a command. To do anything, you had to know the right words to type, the right commands to issue, and if you typed a single character wrong, the machine would simply tell you it did not understand and wait for you to try again. This kind of interface, called a command line interface, was perfectly natural for the engineers and hobbyists who had built the machines. But for most people, it was a barrier. It required memorization and precision. It was not forgiving. It did not invite exploration. The computer remained, for all its new affordability, a machine for people who were willing to learn its language. The change that would make computers accessible to almost anyone, regardless of technical training, had its roots in a research laboratory in Palo Alto, California, a place called Xerox PARC. PARC stood for Palo Alto Research Center, and it was funded by the Xerox Corporation, the company that had made its fortune with photocopiers. In the 1970s, Xerox assembled a remarkable group of scientists and engineers and gave them the freedom to imagine what the future of computing might look like. They imagined a great deal. Among the things they developed was a new way of interacting with a computer, one that did not require typing commands at all. Instead, the screen showed a visual representation of a desktop, with small pictures called icons that stood for files, folders, and programs. You could point at these icons with a device that moved a pointer on the screen, a small handheld object that rolled across the desk on a ball and had one or more buttons on top. The researchers called it a mouse because the cord connecting it to the computer looked a little like a tail. By moving the mouse and clicking the button, you could select an icon, open it, drag it to a new location, or drop it into a folder. The screen was divided into rectangular areas called windows, each one showing a different program or document. You could have multiple windows open at once, overlapping like papers on a real desktop, and you could switch between them simply by clicking on the one you wanted. This was called a graphical user interface, or GUI for short, and it was a profound change in the relationship between humans and machines. The Xerox PARC team built a computer called the Alto that embodied these ideas. It had a bitmap screen, meaning that every tiny dot on the screen could be controlled individually, allowing it to display graphics, text in different fonts, and images. It had a mouse. It had windows and icons and menus that dropped down when you clicked on them. It was, in many ways, the prototype of every modern computer interface. But the Alto was not sold as a commercial product. Xerox, focused on its copier business, did not fully grasp the value of what its researchers had created. The Alto remained a research machine, seen by only a few thousand people, mostly within the company and at a few universities. One of the people who did see it was Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple. In 1979, he visited Xerox PARC and saw a demonstration of the Alto's graphical interface. He understood immediately that this was the future. He later said that the visit was like seeing a glimpse of what every computer would one day become. Apple began work on its own graphical interface, first on a machine called the Lisa, which was released in 1983, but was too expensive to succeed, and then on a smaller, more affordable machine called the Macintosh. The Macintosh was introduced in 1984 with a now famous television commercial and a great deal of public attention. It was not the first computer with a graphical interface, and it was not the most powerful computer of its time, but it was the one that brought the graphical interface to a wide audience. The Macintosh had a small black and white screen, a mouse, and a simple set of icons that made it easy to understand. You turned it on, and you saw a smiling face, and you could point and click and drag and drop without ever typing a command. It came with a program for writing documents and a program for drawing pictures, and it was designed so that anyone, even someone who had never touched a computer before, could sit down and start using it within minutes. The Macintosh was not an immediate commercial success on the scale of the IBM PC, It was more expensive than many of its competitors, and it had a limited amount of software available at first. But its influence was enormous. It showed the industry what a computer could be, what it should be. It set a new standard for ease of use, and it forced other companies to respond. Microsoft, the company that had supplied the operating system for the IBM PC, had been working on its own graphical interface for several years. The first versions, called Windows, were released in the mid-1980s, but they were not widely adopted until Windows 3.0 in 1990, and then, with overwhelming success, Windows 95 in 1995. Windows brought the graphical interface to the vast base of IBM-compatible personal computers, the same machines that had once been controlled by a blinking cursor and a command line. By the mid-1990s, almost every personal computer sold came with a graphical interface, a mouse, and a screen full of icons and windows. The mouse and the graphical interface did more than make computers easier to use. They changed the way people thought about computers. A command line interface makes the computer feel like a machine you are giving orders to. A graphical interface makes the computer feel like a space you are moving through, a place where you can explore, where you can see your documents and your programs arranged in front of you like objects on a desk. The difference is subtle but profound. The graphical interface invited people who had never thought of themselves as technical, people who had no interest in learning a programming language or memorizing commands, to use a computer as naturally as they might use a filing cabinet or a bookshelf. It made the computer feel friendly, approachable, even playful. It was the final step in the long journey from the computer as a specialized instrument to the computer as a universal tool, something that anyone could use for anything. The icons, the windows, the mouse pointer moving smoothly across the screen, these are now so familiar that we barely notice them. But they were invented, refined, and popularized over many years by people who believed that computers should adapt to humans, not the other way around. And so, as we let the quiet deepen around us, we can picture that early Macintosh screen, the small black and white display glowing softly on a desk, the little arrow moving across it as a hand guides the mouse. The icons are simple: a folder, a paintbrush, a trash can. The windows open and close with a gentle click. The machine is doing, behind the scenes, all the same Boolean logic, all the same stored program execution, all the same arithmetic that the room-sized computers of the 1940s did. But the user does not need to know any of that. The user just points and clicks, and the machine responds, and the work gets done. The computer has become a tool not just for the mind, but for the hand and the eye, a thing you can touch and see and understand without a manual. The graphical interface is a kind of translation layer, turning the ones and zeros of the machine into a visual language that human beings are naturally good at understanding. It is one of the great achievements of the story we are tracing, and it is the reason that computers are now in nearly every home, every office, every pocket. The mouse is still now. The cursor is frozen on the screen. The windows are closed. The desktop is dark. And we are drifting, slowly, toward the next chapter, the chapter in which these individual machines, these islands of computation, begin to connect to one another, forming a network that will eventually cover the world. But that is a story for the next breath, the next quiet moment of the long, slow night. For now, let the screens rest. Let the icons sleep. The network can wait, and so can we. For most of the story we have been tracing, a computer was a thing that stood alone. It might fill a room or sit on a desk, but it was an island, a self-contained world of logic and memory that did not reach out to other machines. You put information in by hand, through switches or punched cards or a keyboard, and you got information out through lights or paper printouts or a screen. The computer did not talk to other computers. It did not need to. But as computers became more common, and as the people who used them began to imagine new possibilities, the idea of connecting them together began to grow. If one computer could do useful work, what could two computers do, linked by a wire? What could 10 do, or 100, or 1,000? The answers to those questions would eventually transform the world, turning the solitary computer into a node in a vast, sprawling network that would come to connect nearly every person and every device on the planet. The story of that network begins, as so many parts of this story do, with a government research project. In the late 1960s, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, a branch of the United States Department of Defense, funded a project to connect computers at several universities and research institutions. The network was called ARPANET, and its first connection was made in 1969 between a computer at the University of California, Los Angeles, and another at the Stanford Research Institute, hundreds of miles to the north. Soon after, computers at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah were added, and the network grew from there. The idea was simple in concept but profound in its implications. Instead of each computer being an island, they would be linked by telephone lines, and they would share information. A researcher at one university could send a message to a researcher at another. A program running on one machine could access data stored on another. The network was designed to be robust, able to keep working even if some of its connections were broken, a feature that had obvious military value, but also made the network resilient in ways that would prove important later. For ARPANET to work, the computers needed to speak a common language. They needed rules for how to break a message into pieces, how to address those pieces so they would reach the right destination, how to reassemble them at the other end, and how to handle errors and interruptions. These rules are called protocols, and the development of the protocols that underpin the Internet was a long, collaborative process involving many people over many years. The key idea was that the network should be simple and general. It should not care what kind of information it was carrying, whether it was a piece of email, a file, a command to a distant machine, or anything else. The network would just take a stream of data, chop it into small packets, each one labeled with its destination, and pass them along from one computer to the next until they arrived. The receiving computer would then put the packets back together in the right order. This packet switching approach, developed by researchers including Paul Baran in the United States and Donald Davies in Britain, was a fundamental breakthrough. It meant that the network did not need a central controller, a single point of failure that could bring the whole thing down. It could route around damage, find alternative paths, and keep working as long as any path remained. Through the 1970s, ARPANET grew. More universities and research institutions joined. The protocols became more refined, and other networks, built on similar principles, began to appear. Some were academic, some were corporate, some were built by hobbyists. The problem was that these different networks could not talk to each other. They each used their own protocols, their own ways of packaging and addressing data. A computer on one network could not easily communicate with a computer on another. The solution was a set of common protocols that could work across any underlying network, a kind of universal language that any computer could speak. The most important of these were the Transmission Control Protocol and the Internet Protocol, known together as TCP/IP. They were developed in the 1970s, and on January 1, 1983, ARPANET officially switched over to using them, an event that is sometimes called the birth of the Internet. The word Internet simply means a network of networks, a way of connecting many different networks together so that they function as one larger network. And that is exactly what TCP/IP made possible. It did not matter what kind of wire or radio link or satellite connection a network used. As long as its computers spoke TCP/IP, they could join the Internet. The Internet grew steadily through the 1980s, but for most people, it was still invisible. It was a tool for researchers, for academics, for the military, for a small and growing community of technically inclined people who used it to exchange email, share files, and participate in discussion groups. The Internet was powerful, but it was not easy to use. You had to know the right commands to type. You had to know the addresses of the machines you wanted to reach. The information available on the internet was vast, but it was scattered, unorganized, and hard to find unless you already knew where to look. The internet was a library with no catalog, a city with no street signs, a conversation that you could only join if you already knew the language. The change that made the internet accessible to everyone came from an English computer scientist named Tim Berners-Lee. In the late 1980s, he was working at CERN, the European Particle Physics Laboratory near Geneva, and he was frustrated by the difficulty of finding and sharing information among the many different computer systems at the laboratory. He proposed a system that would make it easy to create, link, and view documents stored on any computer connected to the internet. He called his proposal the World Wide Web. The web, as it came to be known, was not the internet itself. It was something that ran on top of the internet, a way of organizing and presenting information that made the internet feel like a single, unified space. The web used three main ideas. The first was a way of writing documents, so that they could include links to other documents, a system called hypertext. A link is simply a piece of text or an image that, when clicked, takes you to another document, which might be on the same computer or on a computer on the other side of the world. The second was a way of naming every document on the web with a unique address, a string of characters that tells the computer exactly where to find it. And the third was a way for a program, called a browser, to request a document from another computer and display it on the screen, with all its text, images, and links rendered in a readable form. Berners-Lee created the first web browser and the first web server in 1990, and he made the technology freely available for anyone to use, without charge or restriction. The difference between the internet and the web is worth pausing over, because the two words are often used as if they mean the same thing, but they do not. The internet is the underlying network, the physical wires and fiber optic cables and radio links, the routers and switches and protocols that move packets of data from one machine to another. The web is one way of using that network, a system of linked pages that you view through a browser. Email is another way of using the internet. Video calls are another. File sharing is another. The internet existed for many years before the web was invented, and it carries many kinds of traffic that have nothing to do with the web. But the web was the thing that made the internet visible, that gave it a friendly face, that turned it from a tool for specialists into a medium for everyone. The first widely popular web browser, called Mosaic, was released in 1993 by a group of students at the University of Illinois. It could display images and text together on the same page, and it was easy to install and use. It sparked an explosion of interest. Millions of people who had never heard of ARPANET or TCP/IP began to get online, to browse the web, to create their own pages. The dot-com boom of the late 1990s, the rise of companies like Amazon and Google and eBay, the transformation of commerce and communication and culture, all of it grew from the seeds planted by ARPANET and the web. And so, as we let the quiet settle around us once more, we can trace the path that a single piece of data takes through this vast, invisible network. A request for a web page, typed into the glowing browser on the phone beside your bed. The request is broken into packets, each one a small chunk of digital information, each one labeled with its destination. The packets travel through the air as radio waves, to a nearby router, a small box plugged into the wall. From there, they travel through cables, through fiber optic lines that carry pulses of light, through switches and routers and servers, crossing cities and continents and oceans. At each step, a device reads the address and passes the packet along to the next step, closer to its destination. The packets may take different routes, some going north, some south, some delayed by congestion or rerouted around a failed connection. When they arrive at their destination, a server computer somewhere in the world, they are reassembled into the original request. The server finds the requested page and sends it back, broken into packets again, traveling the same sprawling, redundant, resilient network in reverse. And within a fraction of a second, the page appears on the screen, words and images and links ready to be read. All of this happens without anyone thinking about it, without anyone seeing the routers and the cables and the switches, without anyone needing to know how it works. The network is so reliable, so seamless, so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life that we only notice it when it fails, and even then, it usually comes back quickly, routing around the problem, finding a new path, keeping the conversation going. The internet is not a single thing, not a single machine or a single company or a single country. It is a collaboration, a web of agreements and protocols and physical infrastructure, built by millions of people over decades, and it is still growing, still changing, still connecting more and more of the world. The network is quiet now, the packets still flowing, the routers humming in their cabinets, the fiber optic cables dark and silent under the oceans. The web pages are waiting, the links unclicked, the servers standing ready for the next request, whenever it comes. And we are drifting, slowly, toward the final part of our story, the part where the network shrinks down to fit in a pocket, where the computer becomes so small and so light that it travels with us everywhere, even into sleep. But that is for the last quiet hour. For now, the network rests, and so do we. The story we have been tracing, the long, slow journey from counting on fingers to the glowing screen that rests beside you now, is a story of shrinking. The first electronic computers filled entire rooms. They weighed tons. They consumed enough electricity to power a small factory. They were tended by teams of engineers, housed in special buildings, cooled by special systems. They were, for all their speed and power, enormous and fragile and immobile. You could not pick one up. You could not carry it with you. You could not slip it into a pocket and forget it was there. And yet, from the very beginning, the forces that would make all of that possible were already at work. The transistor, invented in 1947, was smaller than a vacuum tube. The integrated circuit, developed in the late 1950s, packed many transistors onto a single chip. The microprocessor, introduced in the early 1970s, put the central brain of a computer onto a single piece of silicon, smaller than a postage stamp. With each step, the computer grew smaller, cooler, cheaper, and more portable. The machine that had once filled a room was, by the 1980s, sitting on a desk. And it was not going to stop there. The first portable computers appeared in the early 1980s, and they were portable only in a very generous sense of the word. The Osborne 1, released in 1981, weighed about 24 pounds, roughly the weight of a medium-sized suitcase. It had a tiny screen, a keyboard that folded down like a lid, and a handle on the back so you could carry it with you, though you would not want to carry it very far. It was a computer you could take from one desk to another, not one you could hold in your lap for very long. But it proved that there was a demand for a computer that could move. Business travelers, journalists, people whose work took them away from an office, all of them wanted the power of a personal computer in a form they could take with them. The market responded. Throughout the 1980s, portable computers grew smaller and lighter. The clamshell design, with a screen that folded down over the keyboard, became standard. The machines were still heavy by modern standards, still expensive, still limited in what they could do compared to a desktop machine. But they were improving, driven by the same relentless miniaturization that had turned the room-sized computer into a desktop box. The term laptop came into use, describing a computer that was light enough to rest on your lap without cutting off your circulation. By the early 1990s, laptops were a common sight in airports and coffee shops, in the briefcases of executives and the backpacks of students. The computer had been unplugged from the wall, at least for a few hours at a time, and set free to roam. But the next step was even more radical. In the 1990s, a new kind of portable device began to appear, something that was not quite a computer in the traditional sense, but that contained many of the same components. These were personal digital assistants, or PDAs, small handheld devices that could store contacts, manage a calendar, take notes, and sometimes send and receive email. They were used with a stylus, a small pen-like tool that tapped on a touch-sensitive screen. The Apple Newton, released in 1993, was one of the first. The Palm Pilot, released a few years later, became enormously popular. These devices were not yet phones. They did not make calls, but they were computers, tiny ones, with processors and memory and screens, and they fit in a shirt pocket. The idea that a computer could be small enough to carry everywhere, to be pulled out at a moment's notice and used with one hand, was becoming real. The device that truly merged the computer and the phone was not far behind. Mobile phones had existed since the 1980s, but they were large, heavy, and limited to making calls. Through the 1990s, phones shrank, became cheaper, and added features like text messaging and simple games. In the mid-2000s, the first smartphones appeared, devices that combined the functions of a phone, a PDA, and in many ways a full computer. The Apple iPhone, released in 2007, was a landmark. It had a large touchscreen that responded to the pressure of a finger, not a stylus. It had a web browser that could display full web pages, not stripped-down mobile versions. It had an operating system that could run a wide variety of applications, from maps to music players to games to tools for productivity. It was, in almost every meaningful sense, a general-purpose, stored program computer, the direct descendant of ENIAC and the Manchester Baby, and all the machines we have talked about, but small enough to slip into a pocket, light enough to forget you were carrying it. Other companies followed, using operating systems like Android, developed by Google, that brought similar capabilities to a wide range of devices from different manufacturers. By the mid-2010s, smartphones were everywhere, in the hands of billions of people around the world. The computer had become so small, so cheap, so integrated into daily life, that most people stopped thinking of it as a computer at all. It was just a phone. But it was not just a phone. It was a device with more processing power, more memory, more storage, and more capabilities than any of the room-sized machines of the 1940s could have dreamed of. To say exactly how much more is difficult, because the comparison is not straightforward and precise numbers are hard to pin down in a way that is both accurate and meaningful. But it is fair to say, without exaggeration, that the phone on your nightstand, the one that is probably face down or face up within arm's reach, is many times more powerful than the machines that first put humans on the moon. It is a supercomputer in a shirt pocket, and we use it to check the weather and play word games and send pictures of our pets to our friends. The gap between what the machine can do and what we ask it to do is wide, and that, in its own way, is a testament to how far we have come. Computing has become so abundant, so cheap, so reliable, that we can afford to waste it on trivial things. We can afford to let it rest beside us while we sleep, doing nothing, or doing the small, quiet tasks we ask of it, like playing a soft sound to help us drift off. And now, as we draw near the end of our long journey through the centuries, there is one more thing to mention, not because it is the most important part of the story, but because it is the part that is still being written. In recent years, a branch of computing has developed that deals with software that can learn patterns from large amounts of data. This is sometimes called machine learning or artificial intelligence, and it allows computers to do things that were once thought to require human judgment, like recognizing faces in photographs, translating between languages, or generating text and images. The basic ideas behind this work have been around for decades, but the recent advances have been driven by the same forces that have driven the rest of the story. Faster processors, larger memories, cheaper storage, and the vast amounts of data that the Internet has made available. This is not a settled chapter of history. It is an ongoing development, and its full implications are not yet clear, but it is part of the same long arc we have been tracing, the arc that began with a woman at a desk with a pencil, that moved through gears and vacuum tubes and transistors and integrated circuits, that brought us the stored program and the graphical interface, and the Internet and the smartphone. The machines are still learning, the story is still going, but we, tonight, can let it rest. Because the story we set out to tell, the story of how we got from counting on fingers to the phone resting nearby, is now complete. Not complete in the sense that computing is finished, that no further chapters will be written, but complete in the sense that we have walked, at a slow and steady pace, through the major steps of the journey. We began with the human computer, the person with a pencil and a page, doing arithmetic by hand in a quiet room. We moved through the abacus and the tally stick, the Antikythera mechanism and the quipu, the earliest tools for making numbers physical. We watched Pascal and Leibniz build their gear-driven calculators, the first machines that could follow a rule and produce a result without a human mind guiding every step. We saw the Jacquard loom, with its punched cards, introduce the idea of stored instructions, the idea that a machine could be told what to do by feeding it a swappable set of commands. We lingered with Babbage and Lovelace, the visionary and the explainer, who dreamed of a general-purpose programmable computer a century before it could be built. We followed Hollerith and his census machines as computing moved from the drawing room to the factory floor, from invention to industry. We traced the rise of electronic logic, from Boole's algebra of true and false, to Shannon's circuits, to Turing's imaginary machine, the theoretical foundation on which everything else would rest. We heard the hum of the wartime computers, the bombs at Bletchley Park, and the ENIAC at the Moore School, the first electronic machines to do useful work. We saw the stored program take hold, turning the computer from a hard-wired appliance into a flexible, reprogrammable tool. We watched the vacuum tube give way to the transistor give way to the integrated circuit, the mainframe shrink to the mini-computer, and then to the personal computer. We saw the graphical interface make computers usable by anyone, not just specialists. We saw the internet and the web connect all those individual machines into a single global network, a fabric of information that covers the earth. And finally, we saw the computer shrink again, into the laptop, into the smartphone, into the small, dark glass rectangle that now rests beside your bed. That is probably the last thing you look at before you sleep, and the first thing you reach for when you wake. And through all of it, through all the centuries and all the inventions and all the names we have spoken and the many more we have not, the same human hand has been there, the hand that once counted on fingers, that once moved beads on an abacus, that once tied knots in a cord and scratched notches in a stick, the hand that once turned the dials of a Pascaline, that once laced punched cards into a chain for the Jacquard loom, that once flipped the switches of an Altair 8800, the hand that now swipes across a glass screen, that taps out a message, that reaches out in the dark to check the time or silence an alarm. The tools have changed over and over, but the hand remains. The hand is the beginning and the end of the story. The hand is what all of this was built for, to extend its reach, to amplify its power, to give it new ways of counting and connecting and creating. And now, as the night deepens and the last lights go out, the hand can rest. The computer can rest beside it, dark and still, its billions of tiny switches all in their off state, waiting for the morning. The long journey from fingers to silicon is complete, for now. There is nothing more to count, nothing more to calculate, nothing more to search for or scroll through or tap. There is only the quiet dark, the slow rhythm of breathing, the soft edge of sleep approaching like a tide. Let the machines wait. Let the centuries rest. Let the hand that once did all this counting alone lie still and open, near the small glowing screen that carries within it the echoes of every machine that came before. The story is told, the night is deep, and you, at last, can sleep.